A cryptic letter arrives at Miss Marple's quiet cottage, taunting her with a secret from her past and warning of a murder in Danimouth. Who knows the truth about the prim spinster's hidden shame? As bodies fall and clues unravel, can Miss Marple outwit a killer who's always one step ahead, watching her every move? Or will her own buried truth destroy her before the final twist is revealed? Chapter 1. A Letter from the Past. Morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table where she sat with her breakfast. A pot of tea steamed gently, beside a plate of toast and marmalade, but Miss Marple's attention was fixed on the letter in her hand. Its envelope, cream-coloured and slightly crumpled, bore no return address, only her name in a spidery, unfamiliar script. She had opened it with her usual calm curiosity, expecting perhaps an invitation to a village fete, or a note from one of her many correspondents. Instead, the words within had sent a faint chill through her, a sensation she hadn't felt in years. The letter read, "Dear Miss Marple, you think your secrets are safe, buried in the dust of years, but I know them. I know what you did, or rather, what you didn't do. Your prim little life in St. Mary Mead hides a stain, doesn't it? Soon all will know, but first there will be a reckoning. In Danimouth, a death is coming. Try to stop it, if you dare. I'll be watching. Yours, in truth, a friend." Miss Marple set the letter down, her pale blue eyes narrowing as she gazed at the garden beyond the window. The roses were in full bloom, their petals a vivid contrast to the unease curling in her chest. She was no stranger to threats or mysteries. Her quiet village had seen its share of both, and her knack for unravelling them had earned her a reputation far beyond St. Mary Mead. But this was different. This was personal. The mention of a stain, and a secret pricked at memories she had long set aside, memories of choices made in youth, of paths not taken. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her cardigan. Whoever had written it knew enough to unsettle her, and that alone made it worth investigating. She rose, her movements slow but deliberate, and crossed to the mantelpiece where a small ormolu clock ticked softly. It was just past 9, early, enough to make arrangements. Danimouth, the letter had said, a bustling seaside town, not far by train, known for its grand hotels and lively summer crowds. She had visited once or twice, years ago, for a charity bazaar and a brief holiday with her nephew, Raymond West. A death, the letter promised. She had no intention of letting such a threat go unanswered, not when it dared to reach into her own past by noon. Miss Marple had packed a modest suitcase to sensible dresses, a warm shawl, her knitting, and a notebook for jotting observations. She telephoned Raymond to inform him of her plans, keeping her tone light to avoid his inevitable fussing. "Just a little trip, dear," she said, "to clear my head by the sea." Raymond, preoccupied with his latest novel, accepted this, with only mild protest, promising to check on her cottage. She then sent a note to her friend Dolly Bantry, asking her to keep an ear out for village gossip, as one never knew where a clue might surface. The train to Danimouth was a pleasant affair, winding through green hills and past patchwork fields. Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she turned the letter's words over in her mind. The reference to a secret puzzled her most. She was not a woman given to scandal. Her life had been one of quiet virtue, dedicated to her garden, her church, and the occasional unravelling of human wickedness. Yet the letter's tone suggested something specific, something tied to a moment or a person. She thought briefly of Captain Harroway, a suitor from her youth, whose proposal she had gently declined. He had been charming but reckless, and his later disgrace in a financial scandal had been the talk of London. Could the letter writer be connected to him? She shook her head, dismissing the thought for now. Speculation without evidence was a trap, and Miss Marple prided herself on avoiding traps. Danimouth Station was a hive of activity when she arrived, with porters bustling and holiday-makers clutching straw hats against the breeze. Miss Marple secured a taxi to the Seaside Hotel, a respectable establishment she remembered from her last visit. The hotel stood on a cliff overlooking the bay, its white facade gleaming under the afternoon sun. The lobby was all polished wood and chintz, with a faint tense of salt air mingling with the scent of beeswax. The manager, a portly man named Mr. Grayson, greeted her warmly, mistaking her for a regular guest until she corrected him with a gentle smile. "Your room is ready, Miss Marple," he said, handing her a key. "Second floor, with a lovely view of the sea. We're quite full this week summer season, you know, but I've saved you a quiet spot." "Thank you, Mr. Grayson," she replied, her eyes already scanning the lobby. A young couple laughed by the staircase, a group of elderly ladies gossiped over tea, and a solitary man in a grey suit read a newspaper with studied indifference. Any of them could be the letter writer, she thought, or none. She would need to observe, to listen, to let the threads of the mystery reveal themselves. Her room was small but comfortable, with a four-poster bed, a writing desk, and a window that opened to a balcony. She unpacked methodically, hanging her dresses in the wardrobe and placing her knitting on the bedside table. The letter she kept in her handbag, its weight a constant reminder of her purpose. She changed into a lavender dress and pinned a brooch to her collar, a habit that made her feel ready for whatever lay ahead. Then, with her shawl draped over her shoulders, she descended to the hotel lounge for afternoon tea. The lounge was crowded, the clink of china and murmur of voices filling the air. Miss Marple chose a table near the window, where she could watch the room without drawing attention. She ordered a pot of Earl Grey and a scone, her fingers busy with her knitting as her eyes roamed. The young couple from the lobby sat nearby, their laughter now subdued, as if they'd quarrelled. The man in the grey suit was there too, still buried in his newspaper, though Miss Marple noticed he hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. At a larger table, a group of locals discussed the upcoming regatta, their voices carrying snippets of gossip about a wealthy recluse named Percival Hawthorne, who had recently returned to his estate on the edge of town. "Odd man, that Hawthorne," said a ruddy-faced gentleman in tweeds. "Kept to himself for years abroad, and now he's back, throwing money around like confetti. They say he's got a niece living with him, but she's as cold as a fish." "Cold or not, she's set to inherit a fortune," replied a woman in a floral hat. "Though I hear there's trouble in that house, servants whispering about strange visitors at night." Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. Percival Hawthorne. The name was unfamiliar, but the mention of wealth and secrecy piqued her interest. In her experience, money and mystery were often entwined, and a recluse returning to a small town was precisely the sort of situation where secrets festered. She made a mental note to learn more about Hawthorne and his household as she sipped her tea. A young woman entered the lounge, drawing every eye. She was in her late 20s, with auburn hair pinned elegantly and a green silk dress that spoke of money and taste. She carried a notebook and a fountain pen, and her expression was one of determined focus. She approached the manager, who was hovering near the tea trolley, and spoke in a low, urgent tone. Miss Marple's sharp ears caught fragments of the conversations, something about an interview, a deadline, and Mr. Hawthorne's past. The manager shook his head, and the young woman's shoulders slumped before she turned and took a seat at a table across the room. Miss Marple recognized the type at once, a journalist, likely from a London paper, chasing a story. She watched as the woman opened her notebook and began writing, her pen moving with quick, angry strokes. There was something about her mix of ambition and vulnerability that reminded Miss Marple of her niece, Joan, in her younger days. She decided to introduce herself, sensing that this stranger might hold a piece of the puzzle. "Excuse me, my dear," Miss Marple said, approaching the woman's table with her knitting in hand. "I couldn't help but notice you seem a bit troubled. I'm Jane Marple, just visiting from St. Mary Mead. May I join you for a moment?" The woman looked up, startled, but her expression softened at Miss Marple's kindly smile. "Oh, of course," she said, gesturing to the empty chair. "I'm Clara Fielding. I'm here for work, but it's not going as planned. A journalist, I take it," Miss Marple said, settling into the chair and resuming her knitting. "You have that look about you always chasing the truth, aren't you?" Clara laughed, a little ruefully. "You're perceptive, Miss Marple." "Yes, I'm with the Daily Clarion. I'm supposed to write a piece on Percival Hawthorne, the millionaire who's just come back to Dan. But he's impossible to reach, and his staff won't talk. I'm starting to think there's something he's hiding." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. "People often hide things when they've something to lose. Tell me, what do you know about Mr. Hawthorne?" Clara hesitated, then leaned forward, her voice dropping. "Not much, which is the problem. He made his fortune abroad, South America, I think in mining or oil. He left Dannemouth 20 years ago after some scandal no one will talk about. Now he's back, living in that big estate, but he rarely leaves the house. I've heard rumors, shady deals, a missing partner, even a curse on his family. But it's all whispers, no facts. Whispers can be as telling as facts, if you listen closely," Miss Marple said. "And what of his household? You mentioned a niece earlier, I believe." "Yes, Evelyn Hawthorne," Clara said, flipping open her notebook. "She's in her 30s, very reserved. There's also a doctor engaged to her, Leonard Price, and a housekeeper, Mrs. Barrett, who's been with the family forever. Oh, and a gardener, Tom something, who's new. That's all I've got, and it's not enough for a story." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "You've done quite well for a start, my dear. People are like tapestries, pull one thread, and the whole picture begins to show. Perhaps you'll find your thread at Mr. Hawthorne's estate." Clara smiled, warming to the old lady's encouragement. "Maybe you're right. I'm going to try again tomorrow, see if I can get past the front gate. Would you like to come along? You seem like you'd notice things I might miss." "Oh, I'm far too old for traipsing about," Miss Marple said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But I'll be here, knitting and listening. Do let me know how you get on." They chatted a while longer, Clara sharing her frustrations, and Miss Marple offering gentle advice drawn from her years of observing human nature. By the time Clara excused herself to make a telephone call, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. Clara Fielding was a promising ally, and her pursuit of Hawthorne's story might uncover the connection to the letter. She finished her tea and returned to her room, her mind already sorting the day's observations into neat categories. That evening, the hotel dining room was abuzz with chatter about the regatta and the fine weather. Miss Marple dined alone, her table strategically placed, to overhear conversations. The man in the grey suit was there, dining with a woman in a red dress who seemed nervous, her eyes darting to the door. The young couple from the lounge argued quietly, their words indistinct but their tension palpable. Miss Marple noted it all, her memory as sharp as ever, filing away details for later, after dinner. She took a turn in the hotel's rose garden, the sea air cool against her face. The garden was lit by lanterns, and a few guests strolled the paths, their voices carrying. On the breeze, she paused by a bench, pretending to admire the flowers, when she heard a rustle in the shrubs. Turning, she saw a figure slip away into the shadows. A man, she thought, though it was too dark to be sure. Her heart quickened, but she kept her composure. Returning to the hotel with a measured step, back in her room, she locked the door and sat at the writing desk, taking out the letter once more. She read it again, searching for clues in its phrasing. The writer's tone was mocking, almost gleeful, suggesting a personal grudge. The mention of Danamoth and a death implied knowledge of her movements, as if they knew she would come. She opened her notebook and began to write, listing the names she'd encountered: Clara Fielding, Percival Hawthorne, Evelyn Hawthorne, Dr. Leonard Price, Mrs. Barrett, Tom the gardener. Beside each, she jotted a question. What do they know? And at the bottom, in smaller script, she added, Captain Haraway. She was about to retire when a scream shattered the quiet. It came from the floor below, sharp and panicked, followed by a thud. Miss Marple grabbed her shawl and hurried to the door, her slippers silent on the carpet. In the hallway, other guests were emerging, their faces pale with alarm. She followed the commotion downstairs to the lounge, where a small crowd had gathered. Clara Fielding lay on the floor, her green silk dress crumpled, a glass of sherry spilled beside her. Her face was ashen, her lips tinged blue. The hotel doctor, summoned from his dinner, knelt beside her, his fingers searching for a pulse. He looked up, his expression grim. She's dead, he said. Poison, I'd wager. Someone called the police. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart sinking. The letter had promised a death, and here it was, not 24 hours after her arrival. She glanced around, noting the shocked faces, the whispered speculations. The man in the grey suit was there, his newspaper forgotten, his eyes fixed on Clara's body. The young couple clung to each other, the woman sobbing. Mr. Grayson, the manager, wrung his hands, muttering about the hotel's reputation. As the police arrived, Miss Marple slipped back to her room, her mind racing. Clara's death was no accident. She was certain of it. The journalist had been too close to something, perhaps Hawthorne's secrets, perhaps the letter writer's identity. Miss Marple sat at her desk, her knitting untouched, and added a new note to her list. Clara Fielding murdered. Why, she thought. Of the letter again, its taunting words echoing in her mind. I'll be watching. Whoever had written it was here, in Danamoth, and they had struck first. But Miss Marple was not one to be cowed by threats. She had faced murderers before, and she would face this one too. Tomorrow, she would begin in earnest visiting Hawthorne's estate, questioning the household, piecing together the threads of this deadly tapestry. For now, she blew out the candle and climbed into bed, her thoughts as sharp as the stars outside her window. The night passed uneasily, with the hotel abuzz with whispers and footsteps long after midnight. Miss Marple slept lightly, her dreams troubled by images of Clara's pale face and the letter's spidery script. She rose early, determined to make progress before the police cordoned off the hotel. Over breakfast, she overheard snippets of conversation, guests speculating about Clara's death, some calling it a tragic accident, others hinting at foul play. The man in the grey suit was absent, which she noted with interest, and the young couple seemed subdued, their argument forgotten in the face of tragedy. She decided to start with Clara's belongings, hoping to find a clue the police might overlook. With Mr. Grayson's reluctant permission, she gained access to Clara's room, which had been sealed pending the coroner's investigation. The room was tidy, with a suitcase half-packed and a stack of notebooks on the desk. Miss Marple examined them carefully, her gloved hands turning the pages. Clara had been meticulous, her notes filled with details about Hawthorne's business ventures, his sudden return, and rumours of a lost fortune. One page mentioned a missing partner named Victor Crane, who had vanished during Hawthorne's time abroad. Another noted Evelyn's engagement to Dr. Price, with a question mark beside his name. Too good to be true. Miss Marple tucked one notebook into her handbag, intending to return it later. She then turned to Clara's personal effects, a locket with a faded photograph of a woman, a few letters from her editor, a train ticket stub. Nothing pointed directly to the letter writer, but the mention of Victor Crane intrigued her. A missing partner could mean motive, revenge, betrayal, or greed. She made a mental note to ask about Crane when she visited the Hawthorne estate. Leaving the room, she encountered a maid, a nervous girl named Lily, who was sweeping the hallway. Miss Marple smiled kindly, sensing an opportunity. Such a dreadful thing, poor Miss Fielding, she said, her tone inviting confidence. Did you know her, my dear? Lily glanced around, then nodded. A little, ma'am. She was nice, always tipped well. She asked me about Mr. Hawthorne's house, wanted to know if I'd heard anything odd. I told her about the lights in the windows at night, like someone's moving around when they shouldn't be. Lights at night, Miss Marple said, her interest piqued. How curious. And did you see anything else? Perhaps someone watching Miss Fielding? Lily hesitated, then whispered, There was a man, ma'am, in a grey suit. He was always in the lounge when she was, reading his paper, but not really reading, if you know what I mean. Gave me the creeps. Miss Marple thanked Lily and pressed a shilling into her hand, her mind turning to the man in the grey suit. He was becoming a person of interest, though she had no proof yet. She returned to her room to prepare for her visit to the Hawthorne estate, choosing a sensible hat and her sturdiest shoes. The estate was a mile from the hotel, an easy walk, along the cliff path, and she wanted to arrive unannounced to catch the household off guard. The path to the estate wound past gorse bushes and sea cliffs, the air sharp with salt and the cry of gulls. Miss Marple walked slowly, her shawl wrapped tightly against the breeze, her thoughts on Clara's notebook. Victor Crane, Evelyn Hawthorne, Dr. Price's name was a thread, and she was determined to follow them. The letter writer had made a mistake in taunting her, she thought. They had underestimated her, as so many had before, mistaking her age and gentle manner for weakness. But Jane Marple was no ordinary spinster, and she would prove it. The Hawthorne estate came into view. As she rounded a bender, sprawling Georgian manor with ivy-clad walls and tall chimneys. Its gardens were meticulously kept, though the house itself had an air of neglect, as if its owner cared more for appearances than upkeep. Miss Marple approached the iron gates, where a surly gardener Tom, she presumed, grumbled as he let her in. She noted his rough hands and nervous glance toward the house, filing it away for later. At the front door, she was greeted by Mrs. Barrett, the housekeeper, a thin woman with sharp eyes and a tightly pinned bun. "Miss Marple, is it?" Mrs. Barrett said, her tone cool. "We weren't expecting visitors. Mr. Hawthorne is indisposed." "Oh, I shan't trouble him long," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "I'm just a curious old lady, passing through Dannymoth, and I heard such interesting things about this house. May I come in for a moment?" Mrs. Barrett hesitated, then stepped aside, her reluctance clear. Miss Marple entered a grand hall with marble floors and a chandelier that sparkled despite the gloom. She was led to a drawing room, where Evelyn Hawthorne sat reading a novel. Evelyn was, as Clara had described, reserved, with pale skin and dark hair swept into a chignon. She rose, her expression guarded, as Miss Marple introduced herself. "I'm sorry to intrude, Miss Hawthorne," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair. "I was a friend of Miss Fielding's, the journalist who passed so tragically. She mentioned your uncle's fascinating life, and I couldn't resist a visit." Evelyn's eyes flickered, but she maintained her composure. "Clara Fielding. I barely knew her. She came here once, asking impertinent questions. I'm sorry she's dead, but I can't help you." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking as she pulled out her knitting. "Of course, my dear, but perhaps you could tell me about your uncle. He's quite the talk of Dannymoth, coming back after so long." Evelyn's answers were curt, revealing little. "Mr. Hawthorne was in poor health," she said, and kept to his rooms. Dr. Price, her fiancé, attended him daily. Mrs. Barrett managed the household, and Tom handled the gardens. Miss Marple listened, her questions gentle but probing, noting Evelyn's tension when Dr. Price's name was mentioned. Before she could press further, Mrs. Barrett reappeared, announcing that Mr. Hawthorne was resting and could not see visitors. Miss Marple took her leave, thanking Evelyn and Mrs. Barrett with her usual courtesy. As she walked back to the hotel, she felt the weight of the letter in her handbag, its words a constant prod. Clara's death, the Hawthorne household, the man in the grey suit, all were pieces of a puzzle, and she was only beginning to see its shape. She thought again of Captain Harroway, his scandal, his sister Margaret, who had vanished after his fall. Could Margaret be in Dannymoth, hiding behind a new name, seeking revenge? Or was the letter writer someone closer, someone in the Hawthorne circle? Back at the hotel, she found Inspector Craddock waiting in the lounge, his face serious. He was an old acquaintance, having worked with her on past cases, and he greeted her with a mix of respect and exasperation. "Miss Marple, I might known you'd be here," he said. "Clara Fielding's death is looking like murder. Cyanide in her sherry, quick and deliberate. Any thoughts?" Miss Marple shared what she knew. Omitting the letter for now, she preferred to keep that card close until she understood its significance. She mentioned Clara's investigation, the Hawthorne estate, and the man in the grey suit. Craddock listened, his notebook filling with her observations, though he warned her to leave the police work to him. "I'm just an old lady, Inspector," she said, her eyes twinkling, "but I do notice things." That night, as she sat by her window, the sea a dark expanse below, Miss Marple felt a quiet resolve. The letter writer had wanted her here, had wanted her to see Clara's death. They were playing a game, but she was no pawn. She would find them, not by chasing shadows, but by doing what she did best, watching, listening, and understanding the human heart. And when she did, their secrets would be no match for hers. Chapter 2. Arrival at Dannemouth. Train to Dannemouth rattled along the southern coast, its wheels clacking rhythmically against the rails, a sound that Miss Jane Marple found oddly soothing. She sat by the window, her small, neat figure wrapped in a sensible tweed coat, her hands folded over a worn leather handbag. The countryside blurred past green fields, giving way to glimpses of the sea, its surface glinting under a pale November sky. Her eyes, sharp and bright despite her age, were fixed not on the scenery but on the folded letter tucked inside her. Bag's words, penned in a precise, mocking hand, had burned themselves into her memory. A secret from your youth, dear Jane, could unravel all you hold dear. Watch Danamoth closely, a murder is coming. The audacity of it, addressing her so familiarly, had stirred something in her, a mix of unease and resolve. She had faced threats before, subtle and overt, in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead and beyond. But this was different. This was personal, a barb aimed at a past she had long buried. Who could know of her youthful indiscretions, if they could even be called that? And why pair such a revelation with a murder? The puzzle intrigued her as much as it unsettled her, and she had decided, with the quiet determination that had solved many a mystery, to meet the challenge head-on. The train slowed as it approached Danamoth, a bustling seaside town known for its Regency charm and lively summer crowds. Though now, in late autumn, it wore a quieter, more introspective air. Miss Marple gathered her things, a modest suitcase and her ever-present knitting bag, and stepped onto the platform. The air was crisp, tinged with salt and the faint tang of fish from the nearby docks. Porters bustled about, their voices mingling with the cries of gulls overhead. She declined assistance with her luggage, her step surprisingly spry for a woman of her years, and made her way to the taxi rank. The seaside hotel. Please, she told the driver, a ruddy-faced man with a thick Devon accent. He nodded, tossing her suitcase into the boot with a practiced ease. First time in Danamoth, ma'am? He asked as they pulled away, the car winding through narrow streets lined with pastel-coloured buildings. Oh no, Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but clear. I visited years ago, though it's changed a bit since then. She smiled, faintly, her mind drifting to a long-ago summer. A fleeting memory of laughter and a young man's earnest proposal, Captain Haraway, whose name had surfaced in the letter. She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the driver's chatter about the town's recent growth and the return of Mr. Percival Hawthorne, a wealthy recluse whose name had been on everyone's lips. Hawthorne's back at his big house. Up on the hill, the driver said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Queer sort, they say. Been gone years, and now he's stirred up all sorts of talk. Folk reckon he's got secrets aplenty. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. Secrets, you say? What kind? The driver shrugged. Oh, you know, ma'am, whispers about his money, where it came from. Some say he made a fortune. Abroad, not all of it honest. Others reckon he's hiding from someone or someone. He chuckled, but there was an edge to it, as if the town's gossip carried a weight he couldn't quite dismiss. They arrived at the seaside hotel, a charming, if slightly faded establishment overlooking the promenade. Its white facade gleamed in the afternoon light, though the paint was peeling at the edges, and the brass fittings on the door could use a polish. Miss Marple paid the driver, adding a modest tip, and stepped into the lobby. The air smelled of lavender polish and old wood, and a fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting a warm glow over the chintz armchairs and faded rugs. A young woman, at the reception desk, her hair pinned neatly under a cap, looked up with a welcoming smile. Miss Marple, we've been expecting you, she said, checking a ledger. Your room's on the second floor, with a lovely view of the sea. Shall I have someone take your bags? No need, my dear, Miss Marple said, her tone kind but firm. I can manage. She signed the register, her handwriting precise, and followed a bellboy to the lift, noting the other guests in the lobby, a middle-aged couple arguing in hushed tones, a solitary man reading a newspaper, and a young woman, with a sharp, curious face, scribbling in a notebook. The latter caught Miss Marple's attention. There was a restless energy about her, a journalist's keenness, perhaps. Her room was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a writing desk, and a window that opened to the sound of waves. She unpacked methodically, hanging her dresses in the wardrobe and setting her knitting on the bedside table. The letter she placed in a drawer, under a layer of handkerchiefs, though she knew she'd revisit it soon. For now, she wanted to get the lay of the land, to feel the pulse of Dannymoth and its secrets. That afternoon, she took a walk along the promenade, her scarf fluttering in the breeze. The sea was a restless grey, churning against the shingled beach, and the air carried a chill that made her glad of her coat. She passed tea rooms and souvenir shops, their windows advertising cream teas and postcards, and noted the faces of passers-by-locals with weathered faces, visitors bundled against the cold, and a few well-dressed figures who seemed out of place, their eyes darting as if expecting trouble. At a newsstand, she bought a local paper, scanning the headlines for any mention of Hawthorne or recent crimes. Nothing stood out, but she tucked the paper under her arm, sensing it might prove useful. Back at the hotel, she settled into the lounge for tea, choosing a corner table that offered a view of the room. The lounge was a cozy space with floral wallpaper and a grand piano in one corner, though it looked seldom played. A handful of guests were scattered about, an elderly woman reading a novel, a businessman typing on a portable typewriter, and the young woman from the lobby still scribbling in her notebook. Miss Marple sipped her tea, a perfectly brewed Darjeeling, and observed the room with the quiet intensity of a hawk. The young woman, she learned from a passing waiter, was Clara Fielding, a journalist from London, staying at the hotel while working on a story. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Journalists often stirred up trouble, unearthing secrets others preferred to keep buried. She made a mental note to speak with Clara later, perhaps over a shared pot of tea. For now, she listened to the hum of conversation, picking up fragments of gossip about Hawthorne's return, a recent theft at a local shop, and the upcoming winter fete, which promised to draw the whole town as evening fell. The lounge grew busier, guests drifting in for drinks or dinner. Miss Marple lingered, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue scarf. The rhythm of the needles steadied her thoughts, allowing her to process the day's observations. She was just considering a second cup of tea when a commotion broke out near the bar. A glass shattered, followed by a woman's sharp cry. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the source. Clara Fielding lay slumped in an armchair, her notebook fallen to the floor, her face pale and contorted in pain. A glass of sherry, its contents spilled, sat on the table beside her. The hotel manager, a flustered man in an ill-fitting suit, rushed over, calling for a doctor. Miss Marple rose, her knitting set aside, and approached with a calm that belied the quickening of her pulse. She noted the scene with a practiced eye, the glass, the spilled liquid, the faint bitter scent in the almonds, perhaps, or something akin to it. She's fainted, that's all, the manager said, loosening Clara's collar. But Miss Marple, kneeling briefly to examine the girl's face, saw the telltale signs: blue lips, a faint froth at the mouth, poison almost certainly. She glanced at the other guests, their faces a mix of shock and curiosity, and wondered which of them might have slipped something into Clara's drink. A doctor arrived, a local man with a brisk manner, and confirmed what Miss Marple already suspected. Clara Fielding was dead, likely from cyanide or a similar toxin. The police were called, and the lounge was cleared, guests ushered to their rooms or the dining hall. Miss Marple lingered in the doorway, her mind racing. The letter had warned of a murder, and here it was, barely a day after her arrival. Was Clara the intended victim, or had she stumbled into something meant for another? And how did it connect to the secret the letter writer claimed to know? She returned to her room, locking the door behind her, and retrieved the letter from its hiding place. She read it again, her lips pursed, searching for clues in its phrasing. The writer's tone was taunting, intimate, as if they shared a history. She thought of Captain Harroway, his earnest face, and the scandal that had ruined him. Could someone from that time, a friend, a relative, be in Danymath, seeking to punish her for a choice made decades ago? And what of Hawthorne, whose name kept surfacing like a buoy in rough seas? As she sat by the window, the sea a dark expanse beyond, Miss Marple felt the weight of the mystery settling over her. Clara's death was no accident, she was certain, and the letter writer was no idle prankster. Somewhere in Danymath, among the hotel's guests or Hawthorne's household, was a mind as sharp and ruthless as her own, playing a deadly game. She would need all her wits, all her knowledge of human nature, to unmask them before they struck again. The night was quiet, save for the distant crash of waves, but sleep eluded her. She took up her knitting, the needles moving with a steady rhythm, and let her mind wander through the day's events, sorting faces, voices, and motives like pieces of a jigsaw. Clara Fielding, with her journalist's curiosity, had been a threat to someone. Hawthorne, with his shadowed past, was a magnet for secrets, and the letter writer, whoever they were, knew more about Jane Marple than she cared to admit by morning. The hotel was abuzz with news of the tragedy. The police, led by a young sergeant with a serious demeanour, were questioning guests and staff, though their efforts seemed focused on ruling out foul play. Miss Marple, taking breakfast in the dining room, overheard snippets of their conversation: a spilled drink, a possible contamination, an unfortunate accident. She smiled thinly into her teacup. The police were capable, but they lacked her perspective, her knack for seeing the patterns beneath the surface. She spent the day exploring Danymath, visiting the library to check old newspapers for mentions of Hawthorne and calling on a distant acquaintance, Mrs. Bantry, who had a holiday cottage nearby. Mrs. Bantry, always eager for gossip, shared what she knew. Hawthorne had been abroad for decades, amassing a fortune in trade, though rumours of smuggling and worse dogged his name. His return had coincided with Clara's arrival, a fact Miss Marple filed away for later. That evening, she attended a small gathering at the hotel, a charity event organised by the local Women's Institute. The room was crowded with townsfolk and hotel guests, their chatter a lively hum. Miss Marple, dressed in her best black lace, moved among them with the ease of a seasoned observer, her demure smile masking the intensity of her scrutiny. She met Hawthorne's niece, Evelyn, a pale young woman with a distant air, and her fiancé, Dr. Leonard Price, whose charm was almost too polished. The housekeeper, Mrs. Barrett, was there too, her eyes sharp and watchful, and a nervous young man introduced as Tom Ellis, the gardener, who seemed ill at ease in the formal setting. Each of them, Miss Marple noted, carried an air of secrecy, a subtle tension that set her instincts tingling. She engaged them in light conversation, dropping gentle probes about Clara's death and Hawthorne's return. But their answers were guarded, deflecting her inquiries with practiced ease. As the evening wore on, she felt the weight of unseen eyes, as if the letter writer were watching her, gauging her progress. Back in her room, she sat at the desk, a single lamp casting shadows on the walls. She opened her notebook, a small, leather-bound volume she kept for such cases, and began to jot down her thoughts. Clara Fielding, poisoned, likely for what she knew. Hawthorne, a recluse with a questionable past. Evelyn, Dr. Price, Mrs. Barrett, Tom Ellis each, a piece in the puzzle, each with a motive yet to be uncovered. And the letter, always the letter. Its words a thread tying the murders to her own history. She closed the notebook, her mind still turning, and looked out at the sea, its surface restless under a sliver of moon. Dannemouth was a pretty town, but beneath its charm lay something dark, something that had already claimed one life and threatened more. Miss Marple, with her quiet strength and unyielding curiosity, was determined to bring it to light, no matter the cost. The days that followed were a blur of observation and inquiry. Miss Marple took her meals in the dining room, her ears attuned to every snippet of gossip. She walked the town streets, pausing at shops and benches to chat with locals. Her questions so gentle they seemed mere pleasantries. She learned of Clara's reputation as a tenacious journalist, her recent interest in Hawthorne's affairs, and the unease her presence had stirred among the town's elite. She learned, too, of Hawthorne's household, a closed circle of loyalty and suspicion, where secrets were currency and trust was scarce. One afternoon, as she sat in the hotel lounge, knitting and listening to the rain patter against the windows, a maid approached a young girl named Lily with a nervous smile and quick eyes. "Beg pardon, ma'am," Lily said, twisting her apron. "I heard you was asking about Miss Fielding. I saw Summit that night, Summit odd." Miss Marple set her knitting down, her expression encouraging. "Did you, my dear? What was it?" Lily glanced around, lowering her voice. "Just before she ... passed, I saw her talking to someone in the hall. A man, tall, with a doctor's bag. They was arguing, quiet-like, but fierce. Then he left, and she went to the lounge, and, well, you know what happened." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Dr. Price, perhaps, or another man entirely. "You've been very helpful, Lily," she said, slipping the girl a shilling. "If you see anything else, you'll tell me, won't you?" Lily bobbed a curtsy and scurried off, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. The piece fit, but the puzzle was far from complete. She needed more about Clara, more about Hawthorne, more about the letter writer who seemed to know her every move. As the week drew to a close, Miss Marple felt the net tightening, though whether around her or the killer, she couldn't yet say. She attended a church service on Sunday, sitting in a back pew, her eyes scanning the congregation. Evelyn was there, her face pale and drawn, and Dr. Price, his smile as smooth as ever. Mrs. Barrett sat alone, her lips moving in silent prayer, and Tom Ellis hovered near the door, as if ready to bolt. Hawthorne himself was absent, though his name was whispered in the pews, a figure of fascination and fear. After the service, Miss Marple lingered in the churchyard, reading the weathered gravestones and reflecting on the fragility of life. She thought of Clara, so young and full of promise, cut down by a poisoner's hand. She thought of the letter, its words a challenge she couldn't ignore. And she thought of Dannemouth, a town that hid its darkness behind a facade of charm, waiting for someone like her to peel back the layers. She returned to the hotel, her step steady, her mind clear. The game was afoot, and Jane Marple was no stranger to its rules. Somewhere in Danimouth, a murderer watched and waited, but so did she, and she had no intention of letting them win. Chapter 3. The Hawthorne Connection. The morning sun cast a golden glow over Danimouth, its rays filtering through the laced curtains of the seaside hotel's breakfast room. Miss Jane Marple sat at a small table by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed the other guests. Her mind, however, was far from the idle chatter around her. The anonymous letter, with its veiled threat and ominous hint of murder, weighed heavily on her thoughts. Clara Fielding's death the previous evening poisoned in the hotel lounge had confirmed her suspicions. The letter was no idle prank. Someone in this quaint seaside town knew her past, and they were playing a dangerous game. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her sharp eyes scanning the room. The seaside hotel was a charming establishment, its decor a blend of nautical motifs and Victorian elegance. The breakfast crowd was a mix of locals and visitors, their conversations a hum of gossip and speculation about Clara's death. The police had cordoned off the lounge, and whispers of accident and poor girl floated through the air. Miss Marple, however, was not convinced. The letter had predicted a murder, and Clara's death fit too neatly into its warning. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Bantry, a friend from St. Mary Mead, who had joined her in Danimouth for a short holiday. Mrs. Bantry, with her robust figure and cheerful demeanour, settled into the chair opposite Miss Marple, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Well, Jane," she said, spreading marmalade on her toast, "this is a fine mess. A poisoning in the hotel, I heard. The police think it was an accident, some tainted cocktail. But you don't believe that, do you?" Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. "I find it curious, Dolly, that a young woman should die so suddenly after I receive a letter predicting a murder. Accidents are convenient explanations, but they rarely tell the whole story." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You think it's connected to that letter? Oh, Jane, do tell me more. What did it say again?" Miss Marple hesitated. She had shared only the barest details with Mrs. Bantry, reluctant to reveal the letters. Personal taunt about her secret. Instead, she said, it hinted at a crime in Danimouth, and suggested I might be involved in a way. I believe the writer meant to unsettle me, but their mention of a murder was too specific to ignore. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Involved? Jane, that's absurd. You're the most respectable person I know. Well, except for that time you solved the vicarage murder, but that's hardly a scandal." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Respectability is a fragile thing, Dolly. A single whisper can unravel it. But I'm more concerned about Clara Fielding. She was a journalist, you know, and journalists often stir up trouble. I wonder what she was investigating." As if on cue, a young waiter approached their table, balancing a tray of fresh scones. He was a lanky lad with freckles and a nervous smile. "More tea, ma'am?" he asked, glancing at Miss Marple. "Thank you, yes," she replied, noting his fidgety hands. "Tell me, young man, did you know Miss Fielding? The poor girl who passed away last night?" The waiter's face paled slightly. "Oh, not really, ma'am. She was a guest here, always asking questions. Liked to sit in the lounge with her notebook. I heard she was writing a story about Mr. Hawthorne. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Mr. Hawthorne, the gentleman who owns the estate on the hill. Yes, ma'am. He's a bit of a mystery, that one. Keeps to himself mostly, but folks say he's rich as came back to Dannymoth a few months ago after years away. Mrs. Bantry raised an eyebrow. Hawthorne, you say? I've heard that name. Something about a grand house and a fortune made abroad. Sounds like a man with secrets. Most people have secrets, Dolly, Miss Marple said mildly. The question is whether Mr. Hawthorne's secrets are worth killing for. After breakfast, Miss Marple decided to take a stroll through Dannymoth to clear her mind and gather information. The town was a picturesque blend of cobblestone streets, whitewashed cottages, and a bustling harbour where fishing boats bobbed in the tide. She made her way to the local library, a small building with ivy-covered walls, where she hoped to learn more about Percival Hawthorne. The librarian, a bespectacled woman named Miss Turner, greeted her warmly. Miss Marple, isn't it? From St. Mary Mead. We don't often get visitors from so far afield. Are you here for the sea air or something more intriguing? Miss Marple smiled. A bit of both, perhaps. I was hoping you could tell me about Mr. Percival Hawthorne. I understand he's a prominent figure in Dannymoth. Miss Turner's expression grew guarded. Mr. Hawthorne. Well, he's certainly wealthy, but he's not one for socializing. His family owned Hawthorne Hall for generations, but he left Dannymoth 20 years ago, some say under a cloud. There were rumors of shady dealings, though nothing was ever proven. He returned this spring, and since then he's kept to his estate. Interesting, Miss Marple murmured. And has anyone been asking about him recently? A young journalist, perhaps? Miss Turner hesitated. You mean Miss Fielding? Yes, she was here a week ago, looking through old newspapers. She wanted articles about Hawthorne's departure. In 1905, I helped her find a few, but they were vague, mostly gossip about his business ventures abroad. She seemed disappointed. Miss Marple thanked Miss Turner and left the library, her mind buzzing. Clara Fielding had been digging into Hawthorne's past, and now she was dead. The connection was undeniable, but the motive remained elusive. Was Hawthorne himself involved, or was someone in his circle protecting a secret? That afternoon, Miss Marple received an invitation to a tea party at Hawthorne Hall, courtesy of Mrs. Bantry's acquaintance with a local matron, Lady Pennington, who was a friend of Hawthorne's niece, Evelyn. Miss Marple accepted eagerly, sensing an opportunity to observe the Hawthorne household firsthand. Hawthorne Hall was a sprawling Georgian mansion perched on a cliff overlooking the sea. Its stone facade was weathered but imposing, its windows reflecting the late afternoon sun. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry were greeted at the door by a stern-faced housekeeper. Mrs. Barrett, whose grey hair was pulled into a tight bun, her eyes flicked over Miss Marple with a hint of suspicion before she led them to the drawing-room. The room was elegantly furnished, with velvet drapes and a grand fireplace. A small group of guests mingled over tea and sandwiches, their voices a low murmur. Miss Marple's gaze settled on the host, Percival Hawthorne, a tall man in his late 60s, with a gaunt face and piercing blue eyes. He stood by the window, his posture rigid, as if guarding against an unseen threat. Evelyn Hawthorne, his niece, was a striking woman in her early 30s, with auburn hair and a cool, composed manner. She moved among the guests with practiced grace, but Miss Marple noted a tightness in her smile. Beside her was Dr. Leonard Price, her fiancé, a handsome man with a charming smile and a confident air. He seemed at ease, but his eyes darted toward Hawthorne now and then, as if gauging his mood. The final member of the household was Tom Ellis, the gardener, a wiry young man with a nervous habit of rubbing his hands together. He hovered near the door, clearly uncomfortable in the formal setting. Miss Marple made a mental note of his unease, wondering what role he played in the household's dynamics. Lady Pennington introduced Miss Marple to the group, her voice carrying a note of pride. "This is Miss Jane Marple, a dear friend of Mrs. Bantry's from St. Mary Mead. She's quite the sleuth. You know, solved a murder or two in her village." Miss Marple demurred, but her eyes met Hawthorne's for a brief moment. His expression was unreadable, but she sensed a flicker of interest or perhaps wariness. Evelyn, meanwhile, offered a polite smile. "A sleuth. How fascinating. We're rather dull here, I'm afraid. Just tea parties and gossip." "Oh, I find gossip quite illuminating," Miss Marple said lightly. "It often reveals more than people intend." Dr. Price chuckled. "You'll find plenty of that in Dannymoth, Miss Marple. Everyone's talking about poor Miss Fielding's death. A tragic accident, I hear." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone neutral, "though I understand she was a journalist. Journalists can be provocative." Evelyn's smile faltered. "Clara was a guest at the hotel, nothing more. I barely knew her, but she was curious about your uncle, wasn't she?" Miss Marple pressed gently. "Something about his time abroad." Hawthorne's voice cut through the conversation, sharp and cold. "Miss Fielding was a meddler. She came to my home uninvited, asking impertinent questions. I sent her away. Her death is unfortunate, but it has nothing to do with me." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Mrs. Barrett, who had been pouring tea, paused, her hands trembling slightly. Tom Ellis shifted uncomfortably, his eyes fixed on the floor. Miss Marple observed them all, her mind cataloguing their reactions. The rest of the tea party passed without incident, but Miss Marple's thoughts were racing. Each member of the Hawthorne household seemed to be hiding something. Hawthorne's defensiveness suggested a past he wished to keep buried. Evelyn's cool demeanor masked a calculating mind, and Dr. Price's charm felt too polished, too deliberate. Mrs. Barrett's nervousness hinted at a deeper involvement, and Tom Ellis's unease was almost palpable as she and Mrs. Bantry left Hawthorne Hall. Miss Marple glanced back at the mansion, its silhouette stark against the setting sun. The letter writer was here. She was certain someone who knew her past and was using it to taunt her. Clara Fielding's death was only the beginning, and Miss Marple feared more would follow unless she uncovered the truth. Back at the seaside hotel, Miss Marple retired to her room, her knitting in her lap. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where secrets were often hidden in plain sight, revealed through the smallest details: a glance, a hesitation, a misplaced word. Dannymoth was no different. The Hawthorne household was a web of lies, and Clara's death was the first thread to unravel. She opened her notebook and began to jot down her observations, her neat handwriting filling the page. Hawthorne's past, Clara's investigation, the letters, taunt, they were all connected, but the link eluded her. She thought of the letter's mention of her secret, a vague reference to her youth. It was a distraction, she decided, meant to unsettle her. Her past was unremarkable, a life of quiet choices, not scandals. Yet someone believed otherwise, and they were willing to kill to prove it. As the evening deepened, Miss Marple heard a soft knock at her door. It was Lily, the hotel maid, a shy girl with wide eyes and a habit of twisting her apron. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," Lily said, "but I heard you were asking about Miss Fielding. I saw something that night." Miss Marple motioned for her to sit. "Tell me, Lily. Every detail matters." Lily hesitated, then spoke in a rush. "It was in the lounge, just before Miss Fielding died. She was talking to Dr. Price. They were arguing, quiet-like. But I heard her say something about proof and Hawthorne's money. Dr. Price looked angry, ma'am, real. Angry. Then he left, and Miss Fielding drank her cocktail. Not 10 minutes later, she was gone." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Did you tell the police?" Lily shook her head. "I was scared, ma'am. Dr. Price is important, and I'm just a maid, but I thought you'd want to know." "You did the right thing, Lily," Miss Marple said gently. "Now, go back to your duties, and don't speak of this to anyone else." As Lily left, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Dr. Price and Clara had argued about Hawthorne's money, proof of something incriminating, perhaps. Was Price protecting Hawthorne or himself? And where did the letter writer fit in? The web was growing more tangled, but Miss Marple was determined to unravel it, one thread at a time. The next morning, she resolved to visit the police station and speak with Inspector Craddock, a young officer she had met briefly at the hotel. He was competent, she thought, but prone to overlooking the subtleties of human nature. She found him in his office, surrounded by reports about Clara's death. "Miss Marple," he said, rising to greet her, "I didn't expect to see you here. Come to offer your insights." "I hope I'm not intruding," she said with a smile. "I was curious about Miss Fielding's case. Have you determined the cause of death?" Craddock sighed. "Poison. Likely cyanide in her cocktail. We're treating it as an accident for now, perhaps, a contaminated bottle. But I'll admit, it's odd. No one saw anyone tamper with her drink." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Cyanide is a deliberate choice, Inspector. It suggests intent, not carelessness. Have you looked into Miss Fielding's work? She was a journalist, and journalists make enemies." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You think this was personal?" "We've got her notebook, but it's mostly scribbles about Percival Hawthorne, his travels, his wealth. Nothing concrete. Still, I've got men looking into it." "May I see the notebook?" Miss Marple asked. Craddock hesitated, then handed her a small, leather-bound book. Miss Marple flipped through it, her eyes scanning Clara's hurried notes. Most were vague, but one entry caught her attention. Hawthorne, South America, 1900s, shady partner, LP money laundering. The initials LP stood out. Leonard Price, perhaps. She returned the notebook, her expression serene. "Thank you, Inspector. You've been most helpful." As she left the station, Miss Marple felt a chill despite the warm sun. Dr. Price was emerging as a key figure, but the letter writer's identity remained elusive. Was it Price, using the letters to distract her, or someone else manipulating the situation for their own ends? The Hawthorne household held the answers, and Miss Marple knew she must tread carefully. Over the next few days, she made discreet inquiries around Dannemouth, piecing together the town's history with Hawthorne. Older residents recalled his departure. In 1905, amid whispers of a financial scandal, some mentioned a partner, a man who had vanished after the affair. No one knew his name, but the initials LP surfaced in one old newspaper clipping Miss Marple found in the library, buried in an article about Hawthorne's shipping ventures. Her evenings were spent at the hotel, observing the guests and staff. Mrs. Barrett, who occasionally visited the hotel to deliver messages from Hawthorne, was a frequent subject of Miss Marple's scrutiny. The housekeeper's guarded manner and quick glances suggested she knew more than she let on. Tom Ellis, too, appeared at the hotel once, delivering flowers from the estate. His nervous demeanour was unchanged, and Miss Marple wondered if he feared someone in the household. One afternoon, as she walked along the harbour, Miss Marple encountered Evelyn Hawthorne, who was shopping for ribbons. Seizing the opportunity, Miss Marple struck up a conversation, her tone light but probing. "Miss Hawthorne, I couldn't help but admire your composure at the tea party," she said. "It must be challenging, managing such a large household." Evelyn's smile was polite but strained. "It's my duty, Miss Marple. Uncle Percival relies on me, especially since his return. He's not been well." "I'm sorry to hear that," Miss Marple said. "It must be difficult, with Miss Fielding's death stirring up so much talk." "I understand she was curious about your uncle's past." Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly. Clara was a nuisance. She hounded Uncle Percival with questions he had no obligation to answer. "Her death was a tragedy, but I can't say I'm surprised. People who pry often come to grief." The words were spoken lightly, but Miss Marple detected a warning. Evelyn was protective of her uncle, perhaps of herself. As they parted, Miss Marple filed the exchange away, another piece of the puzzle. That evening, back at the hotel, Miss Marple received a second letter. It was slipped under her door, its handwriting identical to the first. Her heart sank as she read it. "Meddling old woman, you think you're clever, but you're blind to the truth. Your secret will bury you, just as it buried her. Danamouth isn't safe for you." The threat was clear, but Miss Marple's resolve hardened. The letter writer was growing bold, and their mention of her confirmed Clara's death was no accident. She tucked the letter into her bag, determined to show it to Inspector Craddock. But first, she needed to understand the Hawthorne household's secret sand, her own supposed secret, which the writer seemed so eager to exploit. As she sat by her window, the sea stretching dark and endless beyond, Miss Marple thought of Captain Harroway, the suitor from her youth mentioned in the first letter. He had been charming but reckless, his proposal rejected when she sensed his instability. His later disgrace, a swindle that ruined several families, had shocked her, but she had played no role in it. Why, then, did the letter writer believe she had a secret worth killing for? The answer, she suspected, lay in Hawthorne Hall. Percival, Hawthorne, Evelyn, Dr. Price, Mrs. Barrett, Tom Ellis each was a thread in the web, and Clara Fielding had pulled the wrong one. Miss Marple closed her notebook, her knitting needles still. The game was afoot, and she would not rest until the murderer was unmasked. Chapter 4. Whispers of secrets. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's room at the seaside hotel, casting delicate patterns on the worn oak floor. She sat at the small writing desk, her knitting needles idle in her lap, the anonymous letter open before her. The words, written in a sharp, slanting hand, seemed to pulse with malice. "Meddling again, Jane. You think you're so clever, but I know your secret. Captain Harroway's shame clings to you still. Keep poking, and you'll regret it." Miss Marple's lips pursed. The mention of Captain Harroway, a name she had not thought of in decades, stirred a faint unease. She had been young then, barely 20, when the dashing naval officer had courted her in St. Mary Mead. His charm had been undeniable, but his character had proven flawed, a swindler who had defrauded several families before fleeing in disgrace. Her rejection of his proposal had been instinctive, a choice rooted in her quiet but unshakable sense of right. Yet the letter-writer seemed to believe she bore some guilt, some hidden complicity in his ruin. She folded the letter and tucked it into her handbag, her fingers brushing the soft wool of her knitting. The threat was meant to unnerve her, to make her doubt herself, but Miss Marple was not so easily swayed. The letter's arrival in her rooms slipped under the door sometime in the night suggested the writer was close, perhaps even a guest at the hotel, and the murder of Clara Fielding, the young journalist poisoned in the lounge 2 nights ago, loomed large in her mind. The letter had warned of a murder in Danimouth, and Clara's death was no accident. The two were linked, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover how. She rose, smoothing her tweed skirt, and glanced at the clock. It was just past 8, time for breakfast in the hotel dining room. There she might observe the other guests, listen to their chatter, and piece together the threads of this tangled affair. Danimouth was a small town, and secrets, like gossip, had a way of surfacing in unexpected places. The dining room was a cheerful space, with white tablecloths and vases of fresh daisies on every table. A murmur of conversation filled the air, punctuated by the clink of teacups and the rustle of newspapers. Miss Marple took a seat near the window, her sharp eyes scanning the room. At a nearby table, a middle-aged couple discussed the weather in hushed tones, their faces drawn with the strain of recent events. Across the room, a young man in a tweed suit scribbled furiously in a notebook, his brow furrowed, and at the far end, alone with a cup of tea, sat Evelyn Hawthorne, the niece of the reclusive Percival Hawthorne. Evelyn was a striking woman, perhaps 30, with pale skin and dark hair pinned in a severe Her grey dress was elegant but understated, and her posture was rigid, as if she were holding herself together by sheer will. Miss Marple had met her briefly at yesterday's tea-gathering at the Hawthorne estate, where Evelyn had spoken little, her eyes darting nervously whenever her uncle's name was mentioned. There was something guarded about her, a brittleness that suggested more than mere shyness. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Lily, the young hotel maid who set a plate of toast and a pot of tea before her. "Morning," Miss Lily said, her voice bright but tinged with fatigue. "Sleep well, did you?" "Quite well, thank you," Miss Marple replied, offering a kind smile. "Though I imagine it's been a busy few days for you, with all the excitement." Lily's eyes widened slightly, and she leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Oh, it's been dreadful, Miss Fielding, dead just like that. They say it was the wine she drank, poisoned, though the police aren't sure. Everyone's on edge, wondering who could have done it." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "It's a terrible thing. Did you know Miss Fielding at all, Lily?" "Not really, miss," Lily said, wiping her hands on her apron. She kept to herself, always writing in that notebook of hers. "But she asked me once about Mr. Hawthorne, you know, the gentleman up at the estate. Wanted to know if I'd heard any stories about him, what with him being away so long." "And had you heard any stories?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle, but probing. Lily hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. "Well, nothing certain, miss, just bits of talk how he made his money abroad. Maybe not all of it honest. Some say he was mixed up in something shady years ago, but no one knows for sure. He's not the sort you ask questions about, if you take my meaning." "I do indeed," Miss Marple said, her mind turning over this new piece of information. Clara Fielding had been investigating Percival Hawthorne, and now she was dead. The connection was too stark to ignore. "Thank you, Lily," You've been most helpful." Lily blushed and hurried off to tend to another table, leaving Miss Marple to sip her tea and consider her next move. Clara's interest in Hawthorne suggested that the recluse's past held clues to her murder, and perhaps to the letter writer's identity. But the mention of Captain Harroway complicated matters. Was the letter writer someone from Miss Marple's own past, or was Harroway's name merely a tool to unsettle her, a distraction from the real motive? Her gaze drifted back to Evelyn Hawthorne, who was now staring out the window, her tea untouched. There was a hardness in her expression, a flicker of something anger, perhaps, or fear that Miss Marple found intriguing. Evelyn had been present at the hotel the night Clara died, though she claimed to have retired early. Her fiancé, Dr. Leonard Price, had been there too, charming the other guests with his easy smile. Miss Marple had noted how his charm seemed practiced, almost calculated, and how Evelyn's eyes followed him with a mix of devotion and unease. As if sensing her scrutiny, Evelyn turned, her gaze meeting Miss Marple's for a brief moment. There was no warmth in her eyes, only a cold appraisal, before she looked away and rose from her table, leaving the dining room with a swift, purposeful stride. Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with her later, perhaps under the guise of discussing the tea gathering. Evelyn, she suspected, knew more than she let on. The morning passed quietly, with Miss Marple taking a stroll along Dane promenade to clear her mind. The sea was calm, its waves lapping gently against the shore, and the air carried the sharp temps of salt. She walked slowly, her parasol shielding her from the sun, and let her thoughts wander. The letter writer's knowledge of Captain Harroway suggested a personal connection, someone who had known her in her youth or had access to St. Mary Mead's gossip. But the murders Clara's and, she feared others to come, pointed to a larger scheme, one tied to Percival Hawthorne's secretive past. She recalled the other members of the Hawthorne household, Dr. Price, whose charm masked a certain ruthlessness, Mrs. Barrett, the housekeeper, whose quiet demeanour hid a sharp intelligence, and Tom Ellis, the nervous gardener, who had seemed almost frightened during the tea gathering. Each could have a motive, and each could be the letter writer, but why target her? Was it truly about Harroway, or was she simply a convenient scapegoat, a way to divert attention from the real crime? By noon, Miss Marple returned to the hotel, her mind buzzing with possibilities. She decided to visit the local library, a small but well-kept building near the town square, to research Captain Harroway's scandal. The librarian, a bespectacled woman named Mrs. Tuttle, greeted her warmly and directed her to the newspaper archives. "We've got papers going back 50 years, Mrs. Tuttle said proudly. "What are you looking for, if I may ask?" "Oh, just a bit of history," Miss Marple said vaguely, settling at a table with a stack of bound volumes. She began with the year 1895, when Harroway's swindle had come to light. The articles were brief but damning. Naval officer exposed in fraud scheme. One headline read, "Captain Harroway flees, leaving investors penniless." The details were as she remembered. Harroway had promised lucrative returns on a fictitious shipping venture, pocketing the funds before disappearing. Several families in St. Mary Mead had lost their savings, and the scandal had left a bitter mark on the village. One article mentioned a sister, Margaret Harroway, who had defended her brother publicly before vanishing herself. Miss Marple's fingers paused on the page. Margaret, the name stirred, a faint memory, quiet, intense young woman who had once visited St. Mary Mead, her eyes burning with resentment. Could Margaret be in Dannemouth now, seeking revenge for her brother's disgrace? And if so, was she the letter writer, or merely a pawn in someone else's game. Miss Marple spent the afternoon poring over the archives, but found little else about Haraway. She did, however, come across a brief mention of Percival Hawthorne in a 1905 paper, describing him as a gentleman of means who had left Dannemouth for business ventures abroad. The lack of detail was frustrating, but it confirmed Lily's gossip. Hawthorne's wealth was murky, possibly ill-gotten. Clara Fielding's investigation might have uncovered something dangerous, something worth killing for, as evening approached. Miss Marple returned to the hotel, her mind heavy with questions. She was about to retire to her room when she noticed Dr. Price in the lounge, deep in conversation with Mrs. Barrett. Their heads were close together, their voices low, and there was an intensity to their exchange that caught Miss Marple's attention. She lingered near the doorway, pretending to adjust her shawl, and strained to catch their words. "Can't let her dig any deeper," Dr. Price was saying, his tone sharp. "She's already asking too many questions." Mrs. Barrett's reply was softer, almost inaudible. "Be careful, if she suspects." They fell silent as a waiter passed, and Miss Marple slipped away before they noticed her. Her heart quickened. Were they speaking of her, or of Clara Fielding's investigation? Either way, their secrecy confirmed her suspicions. There was a conspiracy within the Hawthorne household, and Dr. Price and Mrs. Barrett were at its heart that night. Miss Marple sat by her window, the letter in her hands once more. The reference to Haraway's shame was a calculated strike, meant to shake her confidence. But she was not the naive girl she had been all those years ago. She had faced blackmailers and murderers before, and she had learned to trust her instincts. The letter writer was close, watching her every move, and the murders were part of a larger plan, one she would unravel, no matter the cost. She thought of St. Mary Mead, of the quiet village where secrets festered beneath polite smiles. Dannemouth was no different. The killer believed they could outwit her, but they had underestimated Jane Marple. With a small, determined nod, she tucked the letter away and picked up her knitting, her needles clicking softly in the stillness. Tomorrow, she would dig deeper, and the whispers of secrets would begin to speak. Chapter 5. A Second Murder. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of the seaside hotel, casting delicate patterns across Miss Marple's room. She sat at the small writing desk, her knitting needles idle for once, as she reread the anonymous letter that had arrived the previous day. Its mocking tone, with its pointed reference to her meddling, lingered in her mind like a persistent fog. The hint about Captain Haraway, a name she had not thought of in decades, had shaken her more than she cared to admit. Yet, as always, Miss Marple's resolve stiffened in the face of adversity. She folded the letter neatly, tucked it into her handbag, and prepared to face the day's inquiries in Dannemouth. The town was abuzz with the news of Clara Fielding's death. The local police, under the direction of Inspector Craddock, had officially declared it an accidental poisoning, it to a contaminated glass of sherry in the hotel lounge. Miss Marple, however, was not convinced. The letter's warning of a murder had been too precise, too deliberate, to align with such a mundane explanation. As she sipped her morning tea in the hotel's dining room, she observed the other guests, her sharp eyes noting every glance, every whispered conversation. The letter writer, she felt certain, was close at hand, watching her every move. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Lily, the young hotel maid who had been so helpful in sharing local gossip. Lily's round face was pale, her eyes wide with the kind of excitement that only a small-town scandal could provoke. "Oh, Miss Marple," she whispered, leaning close as she refilled the teapot, there's been another death. Up at the Hawthorne estate, they found Tom Ellis, the gardener, dead in the greenhouse this morning. Bludgeoned, they say, with a shovel. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained calm. "Dear me," she said softly, setting down her teacup. "How dreadful. Do they know what happened?" Lily shook her head, her voice dropping even lower. "The police are there now, but folks are saying it was a fight gone wrong. Tom was a bit of a loner, always arguing with the other lads in town. But to think to deaths in as many days. Danemouth's never seen anything like it." Miss Marple thanked Lily and watched her scurry off to serve another table. Her mind was already racing, piecing together the fragments of this new development. Tom Ellis, the nervous gardener she had met at the Hawthorne tea gathering, had struck her as a man with secrets. His furtive glances and halting speech had suggested he knew more than he let on. And now he was dead, killed in a manner far too brutal to be dismissed as a mere brawl. The letter-writer's shadow loomed larger, and Miss Marple felt a chill. Of certainty, this was no coincidence. She decided to visit the Hawthorne estate herself, under the pretense of offering condolences. Donning her best hat and coat, she made her way through Danemouth's cobbled streets, the sea breeze sharp against her cheeks. The town was a picturesque blend of old-world charm and modern bustle, with fishermen hauling their catches at the docks and shopkeepers chatting with customers. Yet beneath the surface, Miss Marple sensed a current of unease, as if the town itself were holding its breath. The Hawthorne estate stood on a hill overlooking the sea, its grey stone walls imposing yet weathered by time. As Miss Marple approached the wrought iron gates, she saw a police constable standing guard, his face grim. She introduced herself as a friend of the family, a small fib that her kindly demeanour made easy to believe, and was allowed to pass. The gravel path to the manor was lined with rose bushes, their blooms wilting in the late summer heat, and Miss Marple couldn't help but think of the greenhouse where Tom had met his end. Evelyn Hawthorne, the recluse's niece, greeted her at the door. Her pale face was composed, but her eyes were red-rimmed, betraying recent tears. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice cool but polite. "How kind of you to call. I'm afraid we're all rather shaken." "I can only imagine," Miss Marple replied, stepping into the grand foyer. The house was a study in faded opulence, with heavy drapes and ornate furniture that spoke of wealth long past its prime. "I was so sorry to hear about poor Mr. Ellis. Such a terrible tragedy." Evelyn led her to the drawing-room, where Mrs. Barrett, the housekeeper, was arranging a tray of tea. The older woman's movements were precise, almost mechanical, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands. Dr. Leonard Price, Evelyn's fiancé, stood by the window, his handsome face drawn as he stared out at the gardens. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension, and Miss Marple felt as though she had stepped into a play where every actor knew their lines but feared the next scene as they sat. Miss Marple gently steered the conversation toward Tom Ellis. "He seemed such a quiet man," she said, her tone sympathetic. "Did he have any enemies, do you think?" Evelyn's lips tightened. "Tom kept to himself, mostly. He was good at his work, but he didn't mix much with the staff, I suppose. He might have crossed someone in town." Dr. Price turned from the window, his voice smooth but guarded. "The police seemed to think it was a personal matter. Tom had a temper, I'm told. Perhaps he got into a row with the wrong person." Mrs. Barrett, setting down the teapot, spoke. "For the first time, he was a troubled soul, that one, always muttering to himself, looking over his shoulder. I warned Mr. Hawthorne he wasn't reliable, but he insisted on keeping him on. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes moving from one face to another. Their words were plausible, yet she sensed a carefully constructed narrative, as if they had rehearsed their responses. She decided to probe further. I understand the police are investigating. Have they found anything unusual at the scene? Evelyn hesitated, then shook her head. Not that they've told us. It happened in the greenhouse, you see, near the potting shed. A dreadful place for such a thing. Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail. She was about to ask another question when Inspector Craddock entered, his face wary but professional. He greeted Miss Marple with a nod, clearly unsurprised to find her there. "Miss Marple," he said, "I might have known you'd be in the thick of things." "Just paying my respects," she replied with a small smile. "But since you're here, Inspector, perhaps you could tell Ms. there any truth to the rumour that something was found near poor Mr. Ellis?" Craddock's eyes narrowed slightly, but he answered readily enough. "We did find a scrap of paper, though it's likely nothing. Just a few words, torn from a larger note. We're looking into it." Miss Marple's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. How curious. Words can be so revealing, don't you think? The inspector gave her a knowing look, as if to say he was well aware of her knack for uncovering truths. He excused himself to continue his work, and Miss Marple took her leave soon after, promising to call again. As she walked back to the hotel, her mind was alight with possibilities. A scrap of paper, Craddock had said. She needed to see it, or at least learn its contents. If it bore the words she suspected her secret, perhaps would confirm that Tom's death was tied to the letter writer's vendetta. Back at the seaside hotel, Miss Marple retired to her room to think. She sat by the window, watching the waves crash against the shore, and let her thoughts drift to St. Mary Mead. There she had once known a man like Tom, at least a quiet, nervous sort, who had stumbled into a blackmail scheme and paid for it with his life. The parallel was striking, and it strengthened her suspicion that the letter writer was not only targeting her, but orchestrating a larger game, with the murders as pieces on the board. She decided to speak with Lily again, hoping the maid's penchant for gossip might yield more clues. She found the girl in the hotel's service corridor, polishing silver with a distracted air. "Lily, my dear," Miss Marple began, her voice warm, "you mentioned Tom Ellis earlier. Did you ever hear him speak of anyone in particular? Someone he might have quarrelled with?" Lily glanced around, then leaned in. "Well, miss, I didn't know him well, but I did overhear him once, talking to himself in the market. He was going on about knowing too much and they'll pay for it. I thought he was just drunk, but now I wonder." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "That's very interesting, Lily. Did he mention any names?" "Not that I heard, Miss, but he was always skulking around the Hawthorne place, even when he wasn't working. Some said he was spying on the family, though I don't know why." Thanking Lily, Miss Marple returned to her room, her mind turning over this new information. Tom had known something, perhaps something dangerous, and it had cost him his life. The torn paper, the letters, the murders all pointed to a single mind, cunning and ruthless, weaving a web to ensnare her. But who? Evelyn, with her cold calculation, Dr. Price, whose charm masked a darker edge, Mrs. Barrett, whose secretive manner hinted at a hidden past, or even Mr. Hawthorne himself, whose reclusive nature made him an enigma. That evening, Miss Marple attended a small gathering at the hotel, organized to raise funds for a local charity. The room was filled with Danemouth's notables. Their chatter, a mix of sympathy for the recent tragedies and curiosity about the police's progress. Miss Marple moved among them, her unassuming presence allowing her to listen without being noticed. She overheard a conversation between two women, one of whom mentioned seeing Tom Ellis arguing with Dr. Price near the estate's gates a few days before Clara's death. The detail was small, but it added to Miss Marple's growing suspicion of the doctor as the evening wore on. She found herself seated next to a local historian, Mr. Grayson, who was eager to share his knowledge of Danemouth's past. Miss Marple steered the conversation toward the Hawthorne family, hoping to learn more about Percival's years abroad. Mr. Grayson's eyes lit up. "Oh, Mr. Hawthorne's quite the mystery," he said. "He made his fortune in South America, they say, in mining or some such. But there were rumors, shady dealings, partnerships gone sour. He came back to Danemouth to escape it all, or so I've heard." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And his household? Have they been with him long?" "Mrs. Barrett's been there for years, though no one knows much about her. Evelyn came to live with him after her parents died, and Dr. Pricewell, he's a recent addition, but he's made himself indispensable. Charming fellow, but I've always thought there's more to him than meets the eye." The historian's words confirmed Miss Marple's instincts. Dr. Price, in particular, seemed to occupy a central role in the household's dynamics, his influence extending beyond his engagement to Evelyn. She resolved to keep a closer eye on him, perhaps even to test his alibi for Clara's murder. The next day, Miss Marple paid a visit to the police station, where Inspector Craddock was buried in paperwork. He welcomed her with a wry smile, accustomed to her habit of appearing at the heart of an investigation. "Miss Marple," he said, "I suppose you've got a theory or two about our troubles." "Only a few thoughts," she replied modestly. "I was wondering about that scrap of paper you found. Might I know what it said?" Craddock hesitated, then relented, knowing her discretion. "It's not much to go on. Just 2 words. Her secret doesn't make much sense, but we're checking it against any notes or letters we can find." Miss Marple's heart sank. Though she nodded calmly, her secret, the words echoed the taunts of her anonymous correspondent, confirming her worst fears. The letter writer was not only aware of her past, but was using it to taunt her, perhaps to distract her from the truth. She thanked Craddock and left, her mind racing with possibilities. Back at the hotel, she sat down to write a letter to her nephew, Raymond West, asking him to join her in Danemouth. Raymond, with his literary connections and knack for research, might help her uncover more about Captain Harroway's scandal and its connection to the present. As she sealed the envelope, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The murderer had made a mistake in targeting her, for Miss Marple was not one to be cowed by threats. She would unravel this mystery piece by piece until the truth lay bare. The days that followed were a blur of observation and deduction. Miss Marple spent her mornings walking through Danemouth, chatting with shopkeepers and fishermen, piecing together the town's undercurrents. She learned that Tom Ellis had been seen near the hotel on the night of Clara's death, though no one could say why. She also discovered that Dr. Price had a reputation for being overly attentive to his patients, particularly wealthy ones, a detail that added to her suspicions. One afternoon, while taking tea at a cafe near the docks, Miss Marple overheard a conversation between 2 dock workers. They spoke of a stranger who had been asking questions about the Hawthorne estate, someone who had vanished after Tom's death. The description was vague: a man in a dark coat. possibly a journalist, but it suggested an outside player in the drama, perhaps connected to Clara's investigation. Miss Marple's evenings were spent at the hotel, where she continued to observe the Hawthorne household when they appeared for social events. Evelyn's cool demeanour never wavered, but Miss Marple noticed the way her eyes followed Dr. Price, as if seeking reassurance. Mrs. Barrett, meanwhile, seemed increasingly withdrawn, her sharp glances betraying a fear of exposure. Mr. Hawthorne himself made only brief appearances, his gaunt face and distant manner suggesting a man burdened by his own secrets. As the week drew to a close, Miss Marple received a reply from Raymond, promising to arrive in Dannemouth within days. His letter was cheerful, filled with his usual literary flourishes, but it gave Miss Marple a sense of comfort. She was not alone in this, and with Raymond's help, she might uncover the key to the letter writer's identity. On the 7th day after Tom's death, Miss Marple decided to revisit the Hawthorne estate. She arrived under the guise of returning a borrowed book, but her true purpose was to examine the greenhouse. The police had cordoned off the area, but the constable on duty, recognizing her as a harmless old lady, allowed her to linger nearby. The greenhouse was a glass structure, its panes streaked with dirt, and Miss Marple could see the spot where Tom had fallen, marked by a faint stain on the earthen floor. She stood there for some time, letting her eyes roam over the scene. The shovel, now taken as evidence, had been leaning against a workbench, she recalled from Craddock's description. The torn paper had been found clutched in Tom's hand, as if he had been holding it when he was struck. Miss Marple pictured the moment, Tom alone in the greenhouse, perhaps meeting someone in secret, only to be betrayed by a fatal blow. The paper, she suspected, had been planted to mislead the police, its words chosen to point directly at her. As she turned to leave, she noticed a faint mark in the soil near the greenhouse door, a partial footprint, barely visible but distinct. In its shape, it was too small to belong to a man, suggesting a woman's shoe, perhaps Evelyn's or Mrs. Barrett's. Miss Marple made a mental note to compare it to their footwear, if she could do so discreetly. That night, as she sat by her hotel window, Miss Marple felt the weight of the case pressing down on her. 2 murders, a series of taunting letters, and a web of secrets that stretched from her own past to the present. Yet she was not discouraged. She had faced such challenges before, in St. Mary Mead and beyond, and each time she had emerged with the truth in hand. This time would be no different. She took out her knitting and began to work, the rhythmic click of the needles soothing her thoughts. As she knitted, she thought of the letter writer, their malice a thread running through every event. They had made a fatal error in underestimating her, for Miss Marple was not merely an elderly spinster with a knack for gossip. She was a detective, in her own right, her mind as sharp as any blade, and she would not rest until the murderer was brought to justice. The sea roared outside, its waves a reminder of the relentless passage of time. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her fingers never pausing. The game was far from over, and she was ready for the next move. Chapter 6. The village parallel. Miss Marple sat in her room at the seaside hotel, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floral wallpaper. The sea breeze drifted through the slightly open window, carrying the faint tang of salt, and the distant cries of gulls. Her knitting lay untouched on the table beside her, a pair of needles glinting in the light. As her mind churned over the events of the past few days, the murders of Clara Fielding and Tom Ellis weighed heavily on her, their brutality a stark contrast to the genteel facade of Dannemouth. The anonymous letters, with their taunting references to her past, gnawed at her composure, but she refused to let them unravel her focus. She was no stranger to malice, and she had faced worse in her long life of observing human nature. Her thoughts turned to a memory from St. Mary Mead, a small incident from years ago that now seemed to mirror the present case. It had been a quiet summer, much like this one, when a young woman in the village, Alice Turner, had taken to blackmailing a rival, Mary Stokes, over a trivial indiscretion, a stolen kiss with a married man at a harvest dance. Alice had sent anonymous notes, each one more venomous than the last, threatening to expose Mary unless she paid a small sum. The affair had ended badly. Mary, driven to desperation, had confronted Alice in a public row, and the truth had spilled out for all to hear. Alice, humiliated, had left the village, while Mary's reputation, though bruised, had recovered. What struck Miss Marple now was the motive. Alice's jealousy had been less about the money and more about the power of holding a secret over another's head. It was a petty, vindictive act, rooted in the desire to control and wound. Could the letter writer in Danamoth be driven by a similar impulse? The letters felt personal, their tone laced with a glee that suggested not just knowledge of Miss Marple's past, but a relish in tormenting her with it. The reference to Captain Harroway, her long-ago suitor, had been a calculated jab, stirring memories she had long buried. She had rejected Harroway not out of cruelty, but because she had sensed his instability, a reckless streak that later led to his financial swindle and disgrace. Yet someone now sought to twist that decision into a weapon, to paint her as complicit in his ruin. The question was who and why. Miss Marple rose from her chair, her movements slow but deliberate, and crossed to the window. Below, the promenade bustled with holidaymakers, their laughter and chatter a jarring contrast to the darkness she was unraveling. She thought of the Hawthorne household, each member a piece in a puzzle that refused to fit. Evelyn, the niece, with her icy demeanor and sharp eyes, seemed capable of calculation. But what was her stake in this game? Dr. Price, her charming fiancé, had a polished exterior that Miss Marple distrusted. Charm, in her experience, often masked ambition. Mrs. Barrett, the housekeeper, carried herself with a quiet intensity, her deference too perfect to be genuine. And then there was Mr. Hawthorne himself, the reclusive patriarch, whose return to Danamoth seemed to have set this chain of events in motion. Clara Fielding's investigation into his past had cost her life, and Tom Ellis's death suggested he had stumbled onto something dangerous. Were the murders and the letters part of the same scheme? Or was the letter writer an opportunist, using the killings to amplify Miss Marple's fear? She needed more information, and she knew where to begin. The hotel maid, Lily, had proven a valuable source of gossip, her youthful curiosity and knack for overhearing conversations making her an unwitting ally. Miss Marple rang the bell for tea, knowing Lily would likely be the one to bring it. Sure enough, within 10 minutes, there was a soft knock, and Lily entered, balancing a tray with a teapot, a cup, and a plate of scones. Her round face was flushed, her brown curls escaping from under her cap, and her eyes sparkled with the eagerness of someone who loved a good story. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," Lily said, setting the tray on the table. "It's a fine day, isn't it? Though everyone's talking about poor Mr. Ellis. Such a shock, him being killed like that." Miss Marple smiled, gesturing for Lily to linger. "It is dreadful, Lily. I suppose the whole town is abuzz with theories. Have you heard anything?" "Interesting." Lily needed little encouragement. She glanced at the door, as if to ensure they were alone, then leaned closer. "Oh, miss, you wouldn't believe the things people are saying. Some reckon it was a thief, caught by Mr. Ellis in the greenhouse, but others think it's to do with Mr. Hawthorne's money. They say he's got a fortune stashed away, made from shady dealings abroad. Not that I'd know, mind you, but the cook at the Hawthorne estate, she's my cousin's friend, says Mr. Hawthorne's not been right since he came back. Keeps to himself, locks his study door, and snaps at anyone who asks questions." Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea, her expression one of polite curiosity, though her mind was racing. "That does sound peculiar. And what about the rest of the household? Miss Evelyn, for instance, or Dr. Price?" Lily's eyes widened. "Well, Miss Evelyn's a cold one, if you don't mind me saying. My friend Jenny, who cleans at the estate, says she's always watching everyone, like she's waiting for them to slip up. And Dr. Price, oh, he's ever so handsome, but Jenny says he's got a temper. Caught him shouting at Mrs. Barrett once, something about papers he needed. Mrs. Barrett, now, she's odd. Keeps her room locked and doesn't talk much, but Jenny swears she saw her burning letters in the kitchen grate late at night." "Burning letters?" Miss Marple's tone was light, but her interest sharpened. "How curious. I wonder what she was so keen to hide." Lily shrugged, warming to her role as informant. "Dunno, miss, but it's not the only strange thing. There's talk about Mr. Hawthorne's business, too. They say he was mixed up in something crooked years ago, maybe smuggling or worse. Clara Fielding, the journalist who died, was asking questions about it. My cousin says she saw Clara at the library looking up old newspapers about some scandal in London. Reckon that's why someone poisoned her." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind cataloguing every detail. "You've a sharp ear, Lily. It's a pity the police don't have you on their payroll." Lily giggled, blushing. "Oh, go on, miss. I just hear things, that's all. But it's creepy, isn't it? To murders and those letters you mentioned. You don't think they're connected, do you?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "I think, Lily, that in a place like Danimouth, everything is connected if you look closely enough. Thank you for the tea and the conversation. You've been most helpful." Lily beamed, curtsied awkwardly, and left, closing the door behind her. Miss Marple set her cup down and reached for her notebook, a small leather-bound volume she kept for jotting down thoughts. She wrote, "Hawthorne shady business abroad. Clara investigating scandal. Mrs. Barrett burning letters. Evelyn watching. Price's temper." The pieces were scattered, but they were beginning to form a picture. The St. Mary Mead parallel felt stronger now, a vendetta fueled by resentment or jealousy, cloaked in secrecy, but whose she decided to take a walk to clear her mind and perhaps gather more clues. Danimouth's High Street was lively in the early evening, with shops still open and locals mingling with tourists. Miss Marple, dressed in her usual tweed skirt and sensible shoes, blended easily into the crowd, her unassuming appearance her greatest asset. She paused at a newsstand, pretending to browse the papers while listening to two women nearby, their voices carrying over the hum of the street. "It's a disgrace," one said, her tone indignant. "That Hawthorne man, lording it over the town like he's above us all. My husband says he cheated half the county in his day, and now he's back to do it again." The other woman clucked her tongue. "And that niece of his, Evelyn, thinks she's royalty. She does. I saw her with Dr. Price at the chemist's, buying something in a hurry. Looked guilty, if you ask me." Miss Marple filed the snippet away. her interest piqued by the mention of Evelyn and Price. She bought a newspaper and continued her walk, her steps taking her toward the church, where she knew the vicar, Mr. Clements, was a font of local knowledge. The churchyard was quiet, the gravestones casting long shadows in the fading light. Mr. Clements, a portly man with a kind face, was tending to a rosebush near the gate. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he called, waving her over. "A surprise to see you in Danimouth. I heard you were staying at the seaside. Come for the sea air, or is it the recent troubles?" Miss Marple smiled, adjusting her hat. "A bit of both, Mr. Clements. It's a sad business, these murders. I suppose you've heard all the talk about Mr. Hawthorne and his household." The vicar nodded, his expression sombre. "Too much talk, if you ask me. Percival Hawthorne's always been a mystery, kept to himself even before he left Danimouth years ago. I remember his father, a hard man, but fair. Percival, though, there were rumours he was involved in some unsavoury business overseas. Nothing proven, mind you, but people talk. And now with Clara Fielding and poor Tom Ellis is dead, the rumours are worse." "And the rest of the household?" Miss Marple asked, her tone casual. "Miss Evelyn, Dr. Price, Mrs. Barrett do they come to services?" Mr. Clements hesitated, choosing his words. "Evelyn comes now and then, but it's duty, not devotion. Dr. Price is charming, of course, but I've seen him lose his patience with the choir boys over trifles. As for Mrs. Barrett, she's a shadow. Keeps her head down, never speaks unless spoken to. I've tried to draw her out, but she's guarded." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions about Mrs. Barrett deepening. Guarded was a polite way of saying secretive, and secretive people often had something to hide. She thanked the vicar and made her way back to the hotel, her mind buzzing with possibilities. The St. Mary Mead parallel was proving useful, but it wasn't enough. She needed to know more about Hawthorne's past, and about the scandal Clara had been chasing. And she needed to watch Evelyn and Price more closely. Back in her room, Miss Marple sat at the small writing desk and opened her notebook again. She wrote Evelyn and Price at chemists, guilty. Mrs. Barrett guarded burning letters. Hawthorne's rumoured scandal London connection. She paused, then added, "Check library for Clara's research." The library might hold the key to what Clara had uncovered, and perhaps to why she had been killed. The next morning, Miss Marple set out for the Danimouth Library, a modest building tucked behind the town hall. The librarian, Miss Grayson, was a brisk woman in her 50s, her glasses perched on the end of her nose. She recognized Miss Marple from a previous visit and greeted her warmly, looking for something specific. "Miss Marple," she asked, leading her to the reference section. "I believe Clara Fielding was here recently, researching old newspapers," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "I'm curious about what she was studying. Something about a London scandal, perhaps." Miss Grayson's face clouded. "Poor Clara. Yes, she was here, spent hours with the microfilm reader. She was looking at papers from the early 1900s, mostly London dailies. I helped her find articles about a financial swindle, something to do with a company called Harraway and Sons. Does that ring a bell?" Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. "It does, faintly. Could I see those same articles?" Miss Grayson led her to the microfilm reader and set up the reels. For the next 2 hours, Miss Marple pored over grainy images of old newspapers, her eyes scanning headlines about the collapse of Harraway and Sons, a trading company that had defrauded investors out of thousands. Captain Harraway, the company's charismatic frontman, had been the public face of the scheme, promising vast returns on investments in overseas ventures. When the company collapsed, Haraway was ruined, his reputation in tatters. The articles mentioned a sister, Margaret, who had stood by him during the trial, but she disappeared from public view after his conviction. Miss Marple leaned back, her mind racing. Margaret Haraway. Could she be Mrs. Barrett, hiding in plain sight, nursing a grudge against the woman she blamed for her brother's downfall? The letters, with their intimate knowledge of Miss Marple's past, suggested someone who had known her or known of her decades ago. Margaret fit the profile, but the murders were another matter. Were they her work, or was someone else using her vendetta as a smokescreen? She thanked Miss Grayson and left the library, her steps brisk despite the weight of her thoughts. The sun was high now, the town alive with the chatter of market day. As she passed the chemist's, she glanced through the window and froze. Inside, Evelyn and Dr. Price stood at the counter, their heads bent close together, their expressions tense. The chemist handed them a small package, and Evelyn slipped it into her handbag with a furtive glance around. Miss Marple stepped back, pretending to adjust her scarf, her mind cataloguing the scene. What had they bought, and why the secrecy? She returned to the hotel, her resolve hardening. The St. Mary Mead parallel had given her a framework, but the truth lay in Dannymoth, in the tangled motives of the Hawthorne household. Evelyn's cold calculation, Price's hidden temper, Mrs. Barrett's guarded secrecy, Hawthorne's shadowed past, they were all threads in a web, and the letters were the key to unraveling it. She would need to be careful, but she was not afraid. She had faced malice before, and she would face it again. That evening, at the hotel dining room, Miss Marple observed the other guests, her eyes lingering on a table where Dr. Price was dining alone, his charm on full display as he chatted with the waiter. Evelyn was absent, and Miss Marple wondered where she was. She made a mental note to ask Lily about Evelyn's habits, and to keep an eye on Price's movements. The second letter, with its taunt about her meddling, had arrived after she began asking questions, suggesting the killer was watching her closely. She would need to be subtler, but she would not stop as she retired to her room. Miss Marple felt a quiet determination settle over her. The murders, the letters, the secrets, they were a challenge, but she was equal to it. She thought again of Alice Turner and Mary Stokes, of how jealousy and spite had torn their lives apart. Whoever was behind this, whether Margaret Haraway or another, was driven by a similar darkness, and Miss Marple would find them, not for her own sake, but for Clara and Tom, and for the truth that Dannymoth deserved. She picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly in the quiet room, and let her mind wander, piecing together the clues, the whispers, the parallels. The web was complex, but it was not unbreakable, and Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and sharper mind, was ready to pull the first thread. Chapter 7. The doctor's alibi. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of the seaside hotel's dining room, casting delicate patterns on the white tablecloths. Miss Jane Marple sat at her usual corner table, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue shawl. To the casual observer, she appeared absorbed in her craft, but her sharp eyes darted occasionally toward the other guests, noting their movements and expressions. The events of the past few days, the anonymous letters, Clara Fielding's poisoning, Tom Ellis's brutal murder, had set her nerves on edge, though her serene demeanor betrayed none of it. The latest letter, delivered to her room the previous evening, weighed heavily on her mind. Its mocking tone and the cryptic reference to her supposed complicity in Captain Harroway's ruin had stirred memories she preferred to keep buried. Yet, as always, Miss Marple's curiosity and sense of justice overpowered any personal unease. She sipped her tea, observing Dr. Leonard Price as he entered the dining room. The young doctor, with his polished manners and easy charm, had become a focal point of her suspicions. His engagement to Evelyn Hawthorne, the aloof niece of the reclusive Percival Hawthorne, placed him at the heart of the household where so much seemed amiss. Miss Marple had learned from Lily, the hotel maid, that Dr. Price had been absent from Dannemouth on the night of Clara's murder, attending a medical conference in London, or so he claimed. The alibi seemed convenient, perhaps too convenient, and Miss Marple resolved to test its veracity as Dr. Price took a seat across the room, exchanging pleasantries with a fellow guest. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the village fete scheduled for that afternoon. Dannemouth's annual fete was a lively affair, drawing locals and visitors alike to the village green for games, stalls, and gossip. It would provide the perfect opportunity to observe the Hawthorne household in a less guarded setting. She had already arranged to attend with Lily, who had proven a valuable source of local knowledge. Miss Marple suspected that the fete's relaxed atmosphere might coax secrets from those who preferred to keep them hidden. "Good morning," Miss Marple said, a cheerful voice interrupting her reverie. Lily stood beside the table, her apron crisp and her auburn hair neatly pinned. "Will you be needing anything before we head to the fete?" Miss Marple smiled warmly. "Not at all, Lily. I'm quite looking forward to it. I imagine it will be a splendid occasion." "Oh, it always is," Lily replied, her eyes sparkling. "There'll be music, and the vicar's giving out prizes for the best jam. Mind you, there's always a bit of drama. Someone's bound to argue over the cake competition." Miss Marple chuckled. "I dare say there will be plenty to see and hear. Shall we meet at the hotel entrance at 2:00? Lily nodded and bustled off to attend to her duties. Miss Marple finished her tea, tucked her knitting into her bag, and rose to prepare for the day. She had a particular task in mind before the fete, a visit to the Dannemouth post office to inquire about the letters, the anonymous notes, with their precise handwriting and local postmarks, suggested the sender was nearby. If she could uncover any clue about their origin, it might narrow her list of suspects. The post office, a small brick building on the high street, was quiet when Miss Marple arrived. The postmaster, Mr. Gibbs, a stout man with spectacles perched on his nose, greeted her with a nod. "Morning, ma'am. How can I help you?" Miss Marple adopted her most disarming smile. "Good morning, Mr. Gibbs. I'm staying at the Seaside Hotel, and I've received a couple of letters that have me a bit puzzled. They've no return address, you see, and I wondered if you might recall anything about them." Mr. Gibbs frowned, scratching his chin. "Anonymous letters, eh? We get a few of those, though I don't make a habit of prying. Can you describe them?" "They're written in black ink, very neat handwriting, and posted from Dannemouth," Miss Marple said. "One arrived yesterday, and another a few days ago." The postmaster's brow furrowed. I'd need to check the ledgers, but I can tell you we've had a fair bit of mail from the Hawthorne estate lately. Their housekeeper, Mrs. Barrett, comes in regular to post letters. Can't say I've noticed anything odd, though." Miss Marple's interest peaked at the mention of Mrs. Barrett. The secretive housekeeper had been on her radar since their first meeting at the Hawthorne tea gathering. "Mrs. Barrett, you say? Does she post many letters?" "Oh, Mr. Gibbs said. Mostly household business, I reckon. Bills, orders, that sort of thing. But I'll keep an eye out if you like." "That would be most kind," Miss Marple said. "I wouldn't want to trouble you further, but if you do notice anything unusual, perhaps you could let me know at the hotel." Mr. Gibbs promised to do so, and Miss Marple left the post office with a thoughtful expression. Mrs. Barrett's frequent visits suggested she could easily have posted the anonymous letters, but motive remained elusive. Was she acting alone or in concert with someone else? Perhaps Dr. Price, whose alibi Miss Marple was determined to scrutinize. By 2 o'clock, the village green was abuzz with activity. Colourful bunting fluttered in the breeze, and the air was filled with the scents of freshly baked scones and blooming roses. Children darted between stalls, clutching toffee apples, while their parents chatted over cups of tea. Miss Marple and Lily strolled arm in arm, pausing to admire a display of embroidered cushions. The Fates' cheerful chaos was a stark contrast to the dark undercurrents Miss Marple sensed beneath Danemath's surface. "There's Dr. Price," Lily whispered, nodding toward a refreshment tent where the doctor stood with Evelyn Hawthorne. The couple appeared deep in conversation, their heads bent close together. Evelyn's expression was guarded, her lips pressed into a thin line, while Dr. Price's gestures were animated, almost urgent. Miss Marple observed them discreetly. "They seem rather serious for such a festive occasion," she remarked. "Wonder what they're discussing?" Lily shrugged. "Miss Evelyn's always a bit standoffish, but Dr. Price is usually all smiles. Maybe they've had a row." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her mind racing. She decided to approach the couple, using the Fates' informality as an excuse to probe further. "Let's say hello, shall we?" They made their way to the refreshment tent, where Dr. Price greeted them with his usual charm. Miss Lily, enjoying the fete, I hope." "Very much so," Miss Marple replied. "It's a charming event. I understand you were away recently. Dr. Price at a medical conference, was it?" The doctor's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he recovered quickly. "Yes, in London. Fascinating lectures on new surgical techniques. I'm afraid it kept me rather busy." "I can imagine," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "London's such a bustling place." "Did you stay long?" "Just a couple of days," Dr. Price said, glancing at Evelyn, who remained silent. "I was back in Dannemouth by Wednesday morning." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail. Clara Fielding had been poisoned on Tuesday evening, and the train from London to Dannemouth took only a few hours. If Dr. Price had returned earlier than claimed, he could have been at the seaside hotel that night. She made a mental note to check the train schedules. Evelyn spoke up, her voice cool. "If you'll excuse us, Miss Marple, we have some errands to attend to." "Of course," Miss Marple said, watching as the couple moved off toward the cake stall. She turned to Lily. "Did you notice anything odd just now?" Lily frowned. "Dr. Price seemed a bit jumpy, didn't he?" And Miss Evelyn barely said a word. "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "I think it's time we learned more about that conference." As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple and Lily mingled with the crowd, pausing to chat with the vicar, who was judging the jam competition, and Mrs. Tuttle, a local busybody who knew everyone's business. Mrs. Tuttle, delighted to have an audience, regaled them with tales of Danemath's scandals, including a rumour that Dr. Price had once been sued for malpractice in another town. Though the case was dropped, it added another layer to Miss Marple's growing unease about the doctor. Near the bandstand, Miss Marple spotted Mrs. Barrett, the Hawthorne housekeeper, purchasing a raffle ticket. The woman's stern face softened briefly as she spoke to the stallholder, but her eyes scanned the crowd warily. Miss Marple's gaze followed Mrs. Barrett's, landing on Dr. Price, who stood alone by a flower display. To her surprise, Mrs. Barrett approached him, and the two exchanged a few words, their expressions tense. Dr. Price shook his head sharply, and Mrs. Barrett turned away. Her lips pursed. "Well now," Miss Marple murmured. "That was most interesting." "What was?" Lily asked, craning her neck to see. "Dr. Price and Mrs. Barrett," Miss Marple said. "They don't seem to be on the best of terms, yet there's clearly some connection between them." Lily's eyes widened. "Do you think they're in on it together, the murders, I mean?" "It's possible," Miss Marple said, "but we mustn't jump to conclusions. I need to know more about Dr. Price's movements on the night Clara died." The fete continued into the evening, with a brass band playing lively tunes and lanterns glowing in the dusk. Miss Marple, though outwardly enjoying the festivities, was preoccupied with her next steps. She decided to telephone her old friend, Sir Henry Clithering, a retired Scotland Yard commissioner who had contacts in London. If anyone could verify Dr. Price's conference attendance, it was Sir Henry, back at the seaside hotel. Miss Marple placed the call from the lobby telephone, keeping her voice low. Sir Henry was delighted to hear from her, though his tone grew serious when she explained her request. "A medical conference, you say?" Sir Henry said. "I'll have my man check the delegate lists. Shouldn't take long. But, Jane, are you sure you're not getting in over your head? This sounds like a nasty business." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I'm quite all right, Henry. Just a bit of village curiosity, you know." Sir Henry chuckled. "Village curiosity, my foot. I'll ring you back tomorrow." As Miss Marple hung up, she noticed Lily hovering nearby, looking anxious. "Is everything all right, Lily?" she asked. "It's just—" "I saw something at the fete," Lily said, twisting her apron. "After you saw Dr. Price and Mrs. Barrett talking, I kept an eye on them. Later, I saw them behind the tea tent, and they were arguing. I couldn't hear much, but Mrs. Barrett said something about keeping quiet and not ruining everything." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Did she? Now, that's very helpful, Lily. You've done well to tell me." Lily blushed. "I just thought you ought to know. You don't think they'll come after me, do you?" "Not at all," Miss Marple said firmly. "You leave this to me, but do be careful, my dear." That night, as Miss Marple sat in her room, another letter slipped under her door. She opened it with steady hands, though her heart quickened. The message was brief. "You're meddling in things you don't understand, Jane. Your complicity in Haraway's ruin will be your undoing." Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it in her handbag. The reference to Captain Haraway was no longer a surprise, but the threat felt more personal, more urgent. She recalled the old scandal vividly now. Haraway, a dashing but reckless suitor, had proposed to her in her youth. She had refused him, sensing his lack of character. Soon after, he was exposed for embezzling funds from his regiment, a scandal that ruined his career and drove him to exile. Miss Marple had always felt a pang of guilt, wondering if her rejection had pushed him toward desperation. But complicity, that was nonsense, or so she told herself. The next morning, Sir Henry's call came early. "Jane, I've got your information," he said. "Dr. Leonard Price was registered for the London conference, but here's the rub. He left early. Witnesses saw him at the opening lecture on Monday, but he wasn't at the Tuesday sessions." He could have caught a late train back to Danimouth that night. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. That's most illuminating, Henry. Thank you. Be careful, Jane, Sir Henry said. If this chop's lying about his alibi, he's got something to hide. After the call, Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting absently as she pieced together the puzzle. Dr. Price's shaky alibi, his tense exchange with Mrs. Barrett, and the letter's escalating threats pointed to a conspiracy. But what was their motive? And how did Clara's investigation into Percival Hawthorne's past fit into it? She decided to visit the Danimouth Library to check the train schedules. The librarian, a kindly woman named Miss Porter, helped her locate the timetable for the London to Danimouth route. Sure enough, a train had departed London at 6 p.m. on Tuesday, arriving in Danimouth by 9:30 p.m., just in time for Clara's poisoning at the hotel lounge. Armed with this knowledge, Miss Marple returned to the hotel, her mind buzzing. She needed to confront Dr. Price, but not directly. A subtle approach would be best, perhaps at the Hawthorne estate, where she could observe him among his allies. She sent a note to Evelyn, requesting an invitation to tea, citing a desire to discuss the fate's success. Evelyn's reply was prompt and polite, inviting her for the following afternoon. The Hawthorne estate, with its sprawling lawns and ivy-clad walls, was as imposing as ever when Miss Marple arrived. Evelyn greeted her with cool courtesy, while Dr. Price, Mrs. Barrett, and Percival Hawthorne himself joined them in the drawing-room. The conversation was light, centered on the fate and village affairs, but Miss Marple steered it carefully toward the conference. I hear London's medical conferences are quite the event, she said, smiling at Dr. Price. You must have found it hard to tear yourself away. Dr. Price's jaw tightened, though he kept his tone genial. Oh, it was enlightening, but duty called me back to Danimouth. Duty, Miss Marple said innocently. I'd have thought a conference would keep you until the end. Such a pity to miss the final lectures. Mrs. Barrett coughed, drawing attention, and changed the subject to the weather. Miss Marple noted the housekeeper's quick intervention, as if to shield Dr. Price from scrutiny. The tea passed without further revelations, but Miss Marple left with a clearer picture. Dr. Price was nervous, and Mrs. Barrett was protecting him that evening. Miss Marple sat with Inspector Craddock at the police station, sharing her findings. The inspector, a practical man who respected her instincts, listened intently. If Price was in Danimouth that night, he's got some explaining to do, Craddock said. But we'll need more than a train schedule to pin him down. I quite agree, Miss Marple said, but I believe the letters are the key. If we can trace them to Mrs. Barrett or Dr. Price, we'll have our motive. Craddock nodded. I'll have my men keep an eye on both of them. And, Miss Marple, do watch yourself. These letters sound personal. Miss Marple smiled. I'm always careful, Inspector. As she walked back to the hotel, the sea breeze cool against her face, Miss Marple felt a surge of determination. The web of secrets was unraveling, and she was closer than ever to the truth. Dr. Price's alibi was crumbling, and Mrs. Barrett's role was becoming clearer. But the murderer's endgame remained elusive, and Miss Marple knew she had to tread carefully to avoid becoming the next victim. The chapter stretched on, with Miss Marple's investigation deepening through subtle inquiries and chance encounters. She spoke with villagers who recalled Dr. Price's arrival in Danimouth a year ago, his charm winning over the community despite whispers of a murky past. She learned from Lily that Mrs. Barrett had once worked in London, possibly during the time of Harroway's scandal, strengthening the link to Miss Marple's youth. Each clue, each conversation, brought her closer to the heart of the mystery, though the danger grew with every step. Chapter 8. Uncovering the Past. Miss Jane Marple sat in her room at the seaside hotel in Danimouth, the faint sound of waves lapping against the shore drifting through the slightly open window. The room was modest but comfortable, with a small writing desk, a cushioned armchair, and a single bed draped in crisp white linens. On the desk lay a scattering of papers, a few notes she had jotted down about the case, and the latest anonymous letter, its sharp words still ringing in her mind. You think you're clever, meddling in Danimouth, but your complicity in Haraway's ruin will be your undoing. The letter was written in the same precise, taunting hand as the others, and its mention of Captain Haraway, a name from a chapter of her life she had long since closed, had stirred an unease she could not entirely dismiss. She adjusted her spectacles and leaned back in the armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue shawl. The rhythmic motion steadied her thoughts, allowing her to sift through the tangled threads of the case. To murders Clara Fielding, the ambitious young journalist poisoned in the hotel lounge, and Tom Ellis, the nervous gardener bludgeoned in the Hawthorne Estates greenhouse, had shaken the small coastal town. The police, led by the capable but occasionally short-sighted Inspector Craddock, were pursuing leads, but Miss Marple was certain the key lay in the letters and their connection to her own past. The reference to Captain Haraway was no coincidence. It was a calculated strike, meant to unsettle her and perhaps to distract her from the truth. The mention of Haraway had brought back memories she had not revisited in decades. As a young woman in St. Mary Mead, she had briefly been courted by Captain Edward Haraway, a dashing but reckless man with a penchant for risky ventures. His charm had been undeniable, but Miss Marple, even then, guided by her quiet but unyielding sense of principle, had seen through his polished exterior. When he proposed, she had gently but firmly declined, sensing that his ambitions were built on unsteady foundations. Not long after, Haraway's financial schemes collapsed in a scandal that ruined him. He had left St. Mary Mead in disgrace, and Miss Marple had heard little of him since, save for rumours that he had died abroad, penniless and broken. The letter-writer's claim of her complicity in his ruin was nonsense. Of course she had done nothing but refuse a man who was his own undoing, but the accusation suggested that someone in Danimouth knew her history and was using it. As a weapon, a knock at the door interrupted her reverie. "Aunt Jane," came a familiar voice, warm and slightly teasing. It was her nephew, Raymond West, the successful novelist whose visits always brought a spark of liveliness to her quiet life. "Come in, Raymond," she called, setting her knitting aside. The door opened and Raymond stepped inside, his tall frame filling the doorway. He wore a tweed jacket and a slightly rumpled shirt, his dark hair tousled from the sea breeze. At 35, he was as energetic as ever, his sharp mind tempered by a genuine affection for his aunt. He carried a small leather satchel, which he placed on the desk with a grin. "I got your telegram," he said, settling into the chair opposite her. "You sounded positively cryptic, Aunt Jane. Urgent matter in Danimouth. Need your assistance with research. I half expected to find you chasing spies or unraveling a smuggling ring." Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. "Nothing so melodramatic, I'm afraid. But I do need your help, Raymond. This case is complicated, and I believe it requires a bit of digging into the past." Raymond raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "The past? Yours or someone else's?" "Both, I suspect," she replied, her tone measured. She handed him the latest letter, watching as his eyes scanned the page. His expression darkened as he read the reference to Haraway. "This is vile," he said, folding the letter and setting it down. "Who would dare send you something like this? And what's this nonsense about Captain Haraway? I've heard you mention him once or twice, but I thought he was just some old suitor who faded into obscurity." "He was," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. "But it seems someone in Danimouth believes I played a role in his downfall. I need to know more about what happened to him after he left St. Mary Medand, whether he had any connections to the people here." Raymond leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "You think the letter writer is tied to Haraway? A relative, perhaps? Someone nursing a grudge all these years?" "It's possible," Miss Marple said. "The murders Clara Fielding and Tom Ellis are connected to these letters. I'm certain of it. Clara was investigating Mr. Percival Hawthorne, the reclusive gentleman who owns the estate here. Tom worked for him, and I suspect he knew something dangerous. The letter writer is using my past to taunt me, but their real motive lies in these crimes. I need to understand Haraway's story to find the link." Raymond nodded, pulling a notebook from his satchel right then. "Tell me everything you know about Haraway, and I'll see what I can uncover. I've got contacts in London newspaper archives, old court records, that sort of thing. If there's a trail, I'll find it." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her eyes distant as she recalled the details. "Edward Haraway was a captain in the army, though he left under a cloudsome disagreement with his superiors, I believe. He came to St. Mary Mead in the early 1890s, full of grand plans to invest in a shipping venture. He was charming, persuasive, and terribly ambitious. He courted me for a time, but I saw his recklessness, his tendency to cut corners. When I refused his proposal, he took it poorly, but he soon turned his attentions elsewhere. Not long after, his venture collapsed. He had convinced several local families to invest, and when the scheme failed, they lost everything. There was talk of fraud, though nothing was proven. He left St. Mary Mead in 1895, and I heard he went abroad to India, perhaps, or South Africa. There were rumors he died in poverty, but I never knew the details." Raymond scribbled notes, his pen moving quickly. "And this scandal, any names you remember? People who lost money, or anyone close to Haraway?" Miss Marple frowned, her memory sifting through the years. "There was a family, the Grangers, who lost their savings. They moved away soon after. And, yes, Haraway had a sister, Margaret. She was younger, quite devoted to him. I remember her pleading with the villagers not to judge him too harshly. She was a quiet girl, easily overlooked, but fiercely loyal. I don't know what became of her after he left." "Margaret Haraway," Raymond repeated, underlining the name. "She could be a lead. If she's still alive, she might be here in Danimouth, or at least connected to someone who is." "Anyone else? Not that I recall," Miss Marple said. "But the letters mention my complicity, which suggests the writer believes I did more than reject Edward. Perhaps they think I exposed his scheme or spread rumors that led to his ruin. I did no such thing, but resentment can twist the truth." Raymond closed his notebook and leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "This is starting to sound like one of my novels. A long-buried grudge, a string of murders, and an anonymous tormentor. But why now? Why target you after all these years?" "That," Miss Marple said, "is what I hope you'll help me discover. I suspect the answer lies with Mr. Hawthorne's household. His niece, Evelyn, her fiancé, Dr. Price, the housekeeper, Mrs. Barrett, and even poor Tom Ellis. They all seem to be hiding something. One of them may be the letter writer, or at least know who is. Raymond grinned. You've got a knack for spotting secrets, Aunt Jane. I'll head to London tomorrow and start digging. I'll check the archives for anything on her scandal, his sister, or any connections to Danimov. In the meantime, what's your next move? Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her fingers moving deftly. I shall continue to observe. There's a village fete tomorrow, and I expect most of the household will be there. People let their guard down at such events, and I may learn something useful. But Raymond, do be careful. Whoever is behind this is dangerous. They've killed twice already. Don't worry, Raymond said, standing and slinging his satchel over his shoulder. I'll be discreet. And you, Aunt Jane, promise me you won't go poking into any dark alleys without backup. She chuckled softly. I'm far too old for dark alleys, my dear. Now, go and get some rest. You've a busy day ahead. As Raymond left, Miss Marple turned her gaze to the window, where the moon hung low over the sea. The case was growing more complex, but she felt a quiet confidence. The truth, like a poorly hidden stitch in a piece of knitting, would reveal itself in time. She only hoped she could find it before the killer struck again. The following morning, Danimov buzzed, with preparations for the village fete. Bunting in red, white, and blue fluttered across the town square, and stalls were being set up with homemade jams, knitted scarves, and trays of scones. Miss Marple, dressed in her usual tweed skirt and a neat cardigan, strolled through the square, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. She carried a small basket, ostensibly to hold any purchases, but it also served as a convenient excuse to linger and listen. At a stall selling embroidered handkerchiefs, she spotted Evelyn Hawthorne, the aloof niece of Mr. Percival Hawthorne. Evelyn was examining a lace-trimmed hanky, her expression distant. She wore a tailored green dress that accentuated her slim figure, but her face was pale, her eyes shadowed. Miss Marple approached, offering a gentle smile. "Good morning, Miss Hawthorne," she said. "What a lovely day for the fete. Are you enjoying yourself?" Evelyn started slightly, as if pulled from a reverie. "Oh, Miss Marple, yes, it's pleasant. I don't often come to these things, but Uncle insisted I make an appearance." "He's quite right," Miss Marple said, her tone warm. "A bit of fresh air does wonders. I hear you've been busy at the estate. It must be a challenge, managing such a large household." Evelyn's lips tightened, but she nodded. "It's demanding, yes. Mrs. Barrett is a great help, of course, but there's always something to be done." "Mrs. Barrett seems very capable," Miss Marple said, her voice casual. "She's been with your uncle a long time, hasn't she? I imagine she knows all the family's history." Evelyn's fingers paused on the handkerchief, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she saw a flicker of unease in her eyes. "I suppose so," Evelyn said. "She's been with Uncle since before I was born, but she keeps to herself, mostly." "Of course," Miss Marple said, nodding as if satisfied. "Well, I mustn't keep you. Do enjoy the fete." As Evelyn moved away, Miss Marple filed the moment away in her mind. Evelyn's discomfort at the mention of Mrs. Barrett was subtle but telling. The housekeeper, with her quiet demeanour and sharp eyes, had struck Miss Marple as someone who saw more than she let on. Could she be Margaret Harroway, nursing a decades-old grudge? Or was Evelyn herself hiding something, perhaps protecting her fiancé Dr. Price, whose alibi for Clara's murder was less than airtight? Miss Marple continued her circuit of the fete, pausing at a tea stall where Lily, the hotel maid, was helping to serve. Lily, a bright-eyed girl of about 20, had proven a valuable source of gossip, and Miss Marple greeted her warmly. "Lily, my dear, you're working hard today," she said, accepting a cup of tea. "I don't know how you keep up with all this bustle." Lily grinned, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Oh, it's no trouble, Miss Marple. I like the fate it's a chance to see everyone. Mind you, there's been plenty of talk since poor Miss Fielding and Tom Ellis passed. Folk are saying the Hawthorne estate's cursed. Cursed." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, sipping her tea. "That's a dramatic notion. What do they say?" Lily leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Well, some reckon Mr. Hawthorne brought trouble back with him from abroad. They say he was mixed up in shady business smuggling, maybe, or worse. And now people around him keep dying. It's got folks nervous." "Smuggling," Miss Marple repeated, her tone thoughtful. "That's quite a claim. Has anyone mentioned anything specific about Mr. Hawthorne's past?" "Not much," Lily admitted. "But I heard Dr. Price talking to Mrs. Barrett yesterday when I was cleaning the hotel lounge. They didn't know I was there. He said something about keeping the old man quiet and no more loose ends. It sounded, well, not right." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained mild. "How interesting. And what did Mrs. Barrett say?" "She told him to hush, said the walls have ears. Then they left quick-like when they saw me." Lily frowned. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop, Miss Marple, but with all that's happened, it's got me wondering." "You did quite right to tell me, Lily," Miss Marple said, patting the girl's hand. "But don't you worry. I'm sure the police will sort it all out." As Lily returned to her work, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind racing. Dr. Price and Mrs. Barrett conspiring to keep Mr. Hawthorne quiet. It suggested they were protecting a secret, one that might be tied to the murders. And if Price was involved, Evelyn's loyalty to him could make her complicit or a victim. The pieces were beginning to fit, but the puzzle was far from complete. The fate continued into the afternoon, with children playing games and a brass band playing cheerful tunes. Miss Marple wandered toward a stall selling second-hand books, where she found Inspector Craddock looking slightly out of place in his formal suit. He tipped his hat as she approached. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone respectful but tinged with amusement. "I should have known I'd find you here, sniffing out clues among the jam jars and doilies." She smiled, unperturbed. "A village fete is an excellent place to learn about people, Inspector. They reveal themselves when they think no one's watching. Have you made any progress with the case?" Craddock sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We're chasing our tails, if I'm honest. The poison that killed Miss Fielding was a common one-rat poison, easily bought. No fingerprints on the glass, and half the hotel staff could have slipped it into her drink. As for Ellis, the shovel used to kill him was wiped clean. We're looking into local grudges, but nothing solid yet." "Grudges can run deep," Miss Marple said, her voice soft, "and sometimes they stretch back years. Have you considered Mr. Hawthorne's household? His niece, her fiancé, the housekeeper, they all have motives. If you look closely." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "You've got something specific in mind, haven't you?" "Come on, Miss Marple, out with it." She hesitated, then decided to share a piece of her theory. "Dr. Price's alibi for Miss Fielding's murder is worth reaching. He claims he was at a medical conference, but I've heard there may be gaps in his timeline, and Mrs. Barretchi's a mystery. A woman with her reserve often knows more than she says. You might ask about her past, where she was before she joined Mr. Hawthorne's staff. Craddock jotted a note in his pocketbook. I'll look into it. But Miss Marple, I wish you'd leave the sleuthing to us. Whoever's behind this isn't playing games. They've killed twice, and they're not done. I'm well aware of the danger, Inspector, she said, her tone firm. But I have a personal stake in this. Those letters are addressed to me, and I intend to find out why. Craddock shook his head, a mix of exasperation and admiration in his eyes. Just be careful, that's all I ask. I'd hate to lose the best unofficial detective I know. As he walked away, Miss Marple turned, her attention to the bookstall, her fingers brushing over the worn spines. One title caught her eye, a tattered volume on maritime law, published in the 1890s. It was an odd find for a village fete, and she wondered if it had come from the Hawthorne estate. Flipping through the pages, she found a faint inscription, to E.H., with regards P.H. Her heart quickened. E.H. Wood Haraway and P.H. Percival Hawthorne. It was a tenuous link, but it suggested the two men had known each other, perhaps during Haraway's ill-fated shipping venture. Tucking the book into her basket, Miss Marple resolved to ask Raymond to investigate any business ties between Haraway and Hawthorne. If they had been partners or rivals, it could explain why the letter writer was targeting her now, in Dannemouth, at the heart of Hawthorne's world. That evening, Miss Marple sat in the hotel lounge, a pot of tea before her and the maritime law book open on the table. The lounge was quiet, save for the soft clink of glasses as the bartender polished them. She had written to Raymond, asking him to look for any records of a partnership between Haraway and Hawthorne, and to trace Margaret Haraway's whereabouts after her brother's disgrace. But as she waited for his reply, her thoughts turned. To the household, Evelyn Hawthorne was a puzzle. Her cool demeanour hid a sharp intelligence, but her devotion to Dr. Price seemed to blind her to his flaws. Price himself was charming, but Miss Marple had seen his type before, men who used their charisma to mask ambition or deceit. Mrs. Barrett, with her guarded eyes and precise movements, was the most enigmatic. If she was Margaret Haraway, her resentment would be understandable, but would she resort to murder? And what of Mr. Hawthorne himself, the reclusive patriarch whose return to Dannemouth had set this chain of events in motion? His wealth and secrecy made him a target, or perhaps a puppet master. A soft footstep broke her thoughts, and she looked up to see Lily approaching, her face pale. Miss Marple, the girl whispered, glancing over her shoulder. I found something in Dr. Price's room while I was cleaning. I didn't mean to snoop, but it was just lying there, on his desk. She slipped a small folded paper into Miss Marple's hand and hurried away before Miss Marple could ask more. Unfolding the paper, Miss Marple read a single line, written in a hurried scrawl. The old man knows too much. Deal with it, or I will. There was no signature, but the handwriting was not the same as the anonymous letters. This was something else, a note between conspirators, perhaps. Miss Marple tucked the paper into her pocket, her mind racing. The old man could only be Mr. Hawthorne, and the note suggested a plot against him. Dr. Price was involved, but who was his accomplice? Mrs. Barrett, with whom he'd been seen whispering, or Evelyn, bound to him by love? The net was tightening, but Miss Marple knew she needed more evidence before she could act. As she finished her tea, she noticed a faint scent in the air, perfume, floral and distinctive. It was the same scent she had detected at the fete when Evelyn had stood close to her. Filing the detail away, Miss Marple rose and returned to her room, determined to stay one step ahead of the killer. Over the next 2 days, Miss Marple continued her quiet investigation, attending church on Sunday and chatting with the locals, who were eager to share their theories about the murders. She learned that Dr. Price had been seen leaving the Hawthorne estate late at night, despite his claim of being at the conference. A shopkeeper mentioned Mrs. Barrett's habit of buying rat poison for the estate's gardens, though she always paid in cash, leaving no record. And a fisherman recalled seeing Mr. Hawthorne arguing with a man matching Price's description on the pier. Weeks before Clara's death, each piece of information was a thread, and Miss Marple wove them together. With care, she was certain now that Dr. Price was at the heart of the plot, but his motive remained unclear. Was he after Hawthorne's wealth, or protecting a secret from his own past? And how did the letters fit in? Were they a distraction, or the key to the entire case? On the 3rd day, a telegram arrived from Raymond, delivered to the hotel by a breathless boy. Miss Marple opened it, her fingers steady despite the anticipation. The message was brief, but illuminating. Aunt Jane found records of Haraway's shipping venture. Partnered with Percival Hawthorne, 1893, menos 94. Venture collapsed. Hawthorne escaped blame. Haraway ruined. Margaret Haraway left St. Mary Mead, 1896. Last known in London, no trace after. Checking court records for more. Be careful, Miss Marple. Read the telegram twice, her mind racing. So, Hawthorne and Haraway had been partners. If Hawthorne had betrayed Haraway, it would explain Margaret's resentment and, perhaps, her presence in Danimouth as Mrs. Barrett. The letters could be her revenge, a way to torment Miss Marple while she pursued her true target, Hawthorne. But the murders suggested a more immediate motive, one tied to Price and possibly Evelyn. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the Hawthorne estate, invited for tea by Mr. Hawthorne himself, who had taken a liking to her during their brief meeting at the fete. The estate was grand but faded, its gardens overgrown and its halls dimly lit. Mr. Hawthorne, a gaunt man with sharp eyes, greeted her warmly, though his hands trembled slightly as he poured the tea. "You're a curious woman, Miss Marple," he said, his voice dry. "I hear you've been asking questions about my household. Care to share your theories?" She smiled, deflecting with ease. "Oh, I'm just an old woman who likes to chat, Mr. Hawthorne. But I must say, your estate is full of secrets. I wonder if you know all of them." His eyes narrowed, but he chuckled. "You're sharp, I'll give you that. My household's a mess of Ellen's headstrong, Price is too smooth for his own good, and Mrs. Barrett's loyal but prickly. As for poor Tom, he was a good lad, but he heard things he shouldn't have." "Things?" Miss Marple asked, her tone innocent. Hawthorne hesitated, then waved a hand. "Nothing important, just family squabbles. But I'll tell you this, Miss Marple, there's trouble brewing, and I don't know who to trust." Before she could press further, Evelyn entered, her face composed but her eyes wary. "Uncle, you shouldn't tire yourself," she said, glancing at Miss Marple. "Miss Marple, I hope you're enjoying your visit." "Very much," Miss Marple said, rising. "But I mustn't overstay my welcome. Thank you for the tea, Mr. Hawthorne." As she left, she caught Evelyn's gaze, and for a moment she saw something fear, perhaps, or guilt. It was enough to confirm her suspicions. Evelyn knew more than she was saying, and her loyalty to Price was a dangerous weakness. That night, Miss Marple sat in her room, the maritime law book and Raymond's telegram before her. The case was coming into focus, but the danger was growing. The note Lily had found suggested a plot against Hawthorne, and the murders of Clara and Tom proved the killer's ruthlessness. The letters, with their taunts about Haraway, were a personal attack, but they also served a purpose to distract her, to keep her chasing shadows while the real plan unfolded. She picked up her knitting, her needles clicking as she thought. Mrs. Barrett was likely Margaret Haraway, driven by a decades-old grudge. Dr. Price was the murderer, or at least the mastermind, with Evelyn as his reluctant accomplice. But what was their goal? Hawthorne's wealth, revenge for his role in Haraway's ruin, or something darker tied to his shady dealings abroad? As she worked, a plan began to form. She would need to act quickly before the killer struck again. The next letter, she was certain, would come soon, and with it, an opportunity to set a trap, but she would need Inspector Craddock's help, and perhaps Lily's courage. To bring the truth to light, Miss Marple set her knitting aside and turned out the light, the sound of the sea filling the room. Tomorrow she would take the next step, and with any luck, the killer's mask would finally slip. Chapter 9. A trap set. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's room at the seaside hotel, casting delicate patterns on the worn carpet. She sat at the small writing desk, her knitting abandoned on the bed, as she reread the latest anonymous letter, its sharp, taunting words, mocking her for her meddling and hinting at her past with Captain Haraway lingered in her mind like a persistent fog. The letter had been slipped under her door sometime in the night, its presence as unsettling as the murders that now haunted Dannymoth. Clara Fielding, the journalist, poisoned in the hotel lounge. Tom Ellis, the gardener, bludgeoned in the Hawthorne Estate's greenhouse. And the shadowy threat of a killer who seemed to know her too well. Miss Marple's frail hands, steady despite her age, folded the letter and tucked it into her handbag. She had faced danger before, in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead and beyond. But this case felt personal. The murderer's vendetta was not just against their victims, but against her, weaving her past into a tapestry of violence. She straightened her hat, adjusted her shawl, and resolved to act. The killer was watching her, waiting for her to falter. She would not give them the satisfaction. Downstairs in the hotel dining room, breakfast was a subdued affair. The other guests whispered about Tom's murder, their voices a low hum beneath the clink of teacups. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her sharp eyes scanning the room. The hotel staff moved with practiced efficiency, but she noticed Lily, the young maid who had become her ally, lingering near the kitchen door. Lily's round face was pale, her hands twisting nervously in her apron. Miss Marple caught her eye and gave a slight nod, signalling a need to talk. After breakfast, Miss Marple found Lily in the narrow hallway leading to the staff quarters. The maid glanced over her shoulder before speaking in a hushed tone. "Miss, I heard something last night, after you asked me to keep an ear out. One of the guests, Dr. Price, I think, was in the lounge late, talking to someone. I couldn't see who, but he sounded angry, saying something about keeping her quiet. I thought you should know." Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her mind raced. Dr. Leonard Price, Evelyn Hawthorne's charming fiancé, had been on her radar since she uncovered inconsistencies in his alibi for Clara's murder. His polished demeanor and medical expertise made him a plausible suspect, especially if he had access to poisons. "Thank you, Lily," she said softly. "You've been most helpful. But please, be careful. Don't let anyone know you've spoken to me." Lily nodded, her eyes wide. I won't miss, but are you sure you're safe? Those letters you mentioned, they scare me. Miss Marple patted the girl's arm. I've dealt with worse than letters, my dear. Now, off you go. As Lily scurried away, Miss Marple returned to her room to plan her next move. The killer was growing bolder, leaving letters in her private space. They wanted her to feel vulnerable, to retreat. Instead, she would turn their game against them. If the murderer was watching her so closely, she could use that to her advantage. A trap, carefully set, might draw them out. She sat at the desk again, pulling out a fresh sheet of hotel stationery. Her plan was risky, but she had little choice. The police, led by Inspector Craddock, were competent but focused on surface clues, local feuds, obvious motives. They hadn't connected the murders to the letters or to her past. She needed to force the killer's hand, to make them act before they could strike again. Her pen moved swiftly, drafting a note to Inspector Craddock. She requested a discreet meeting at the hotel that afternoon, hinting that she had uncovered a significant clue about the anonymous letters. She kept the language vague, knowing the killer might intercept it, to ensure the rumor spread. She would share a carefully crafted version of the story with the hotel's chattiest guest, Mrs. Gwendolyn Pratt, a widow with a penchant for gossip. Mrs. Pratt was in the lounge, knitting a garish scarf, when Miss Marple approached. "Good morning, Mrs. Pratt," she said, settling into a nearby armchair. "I trust you're well." "Oh, Miss Marple, as well as one can be with all this dreadful business." Mrs. Pratt's eyes gleamed with curiosity. "2 murders in Dannymoth. I hardly sleep a wink." "It's terribly unsettling," Miss Marple agreed, her tone sympathetic. "Though I've heard something that might help the police." "I shouldn't say, of course, but, well, I've found a clue about those awful letters I've been receiving. It could point to the murderer." Mrs. Pratt leaned forward, her knitting forgotten. "Letters. Oh, my dear, you must tell me." Miss Marple lowered her voice, as if sharing a confidence. "I can't say much, but it's something I found in my room, a detail that matches one of the murders. I'm meeting Inspector Craddock later to discuss it. But please, don't breathe a word." Mrs. Pratt's hand flew to her chest. "My lips are sealed, Miss Marple, sealed." Miss Marple hid a smile. By lunchtime, half the hotel would know. And the killer, if they were among the guests or staff, would hear of it. She excused herself and returned to her room to prepare for the inspector's visit. Inspector Craddock arrived promptly at 3 o'clock, his broad face creased with concern. He was a young man, relatively speaking, with a methodical mind that Miss Marple respected, though she often wished he'd trust her instincts more. They sat in the hotel's small parlour, away from prying ears. "Miss Marple, your note was rather cryptic," Craddock said, adjusting his tie. "What's this about? A clue?" She leaned forward, her voice low. "Inspector, I believe the murderer is targeting me personally, using these letters to unsettle me. I've spread a rumor that I've found a key clue about them. I want to see who reacts." Craddock frowned. "That's dangerous, ma'am. If the killer feels cornered, they might come after you." "Precisely," Miss Marple said, "which is why I need your help. If we watch closely tonight, we may catch them in the act. I suspect they'll try to silence me before I can share what I know." Craddock rubbed his chin. "I don't like it, but you've been right before. What's the plan?" "I'll retire to my room early, around 9 o'clock. Leave a constable nearby, out of sight. If anyone tries to enter my room, we'll have them. And this clue you mentioned." Craddock pressed. "Is it real?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Let's just say I've given the killer something to worry about. Now, we must act quickly. Craddock agreed, though his expression remained uneasy. He promised to station a plainclothes officer in the hallway and to check on her himself later. As he left, Miss Marple felt a flicker of apprehension. She was no stranger to danger, but the killer's knowledge of her past made this case feel like a chess game with stakes higher than ever. The afternoon passed quietly. Miss Marple attended tea at the Hawthorne estate, invited by Evelyn Hawthorne, who seemed eager to maintain appearances despite the murders. The household was Tensavallian's cool politeness barely masked her strain. Dr. Price was overly charming, and Mrs. Barrett, the housekeeper, avoided Miss Marple's gaze. Percival Hawthorne himself was absent, reportedly unwell, though Miss Marple suspected he was avoiding scrutiny. At tea, she dropped another hint, this time to Evelyn. "I've been so troubled by those letters," she said, stirring her tea. "But I've found something, a connection to the past that might explain everything. I'll be sharing it with the police soon." Evelyn's teacup paused mid-air, her eyes narrowing slightly. "How intriguing, Miss Marple. You must be careful. Dannemouth isn't safe these days." Dr. Price, sitting nearby, smiled tightly. "Indeed, you're a brave woman, Miss Marple, poking into such dark matters." Mrs. Barrett, clearing plates, fumbled a saucer, her face pale. Miss Marple noted each reaction, storing them away like pieces of a puzzle. The trap was set. Now she had to wait. Back at the hotel, she dined lightly, her nerves taut but controlled. She chatted with Lily, ensuring the maid would be nearby that evening. "If you hear anything unusual, Lily, fetch the porter at once," she instructed. Lily nodded, her loyalty unwavering. By 9 o'clock. Miss Marple was in her room, the door locked and a chair wedged under the handle for good measure. She sat by the window, her knitting in her lap, though her needles remained still. The hotel was quiet, save for the distant creak of floorboards and the murmur of voices from the lounge below. She had left her light on, the curtains slightly parted, to give the impression she was awake and working. At 10:30, a soft sound broke the silence, a faint scrape at her door, like a key probing the lock. Her heart quickened, but she remained still, her eyes fixed on the door. The scraping stopped, replaced by a low thud, as if someone had leaned against the wood. Then a sharper noise, metallic clink, followed by a muffled curse. Miss Marple rose silently, moving to the side of the room. She had no weapon, only her wits, but she trusted Craddock's constable was near. The door rattled, and she heard a whispered voice, too low to identify. Then a sudden commotion, footsteps pounding down the hall, and Lily's voice, shrill with alarm. "Stop! Who's there?" The door went still. Miss Marple waited, her breath shallow, until a knock came, 3 sharp raps, Craddock's signal. She removed the chair and opened the door to find the inspector, his face grim, and Lily, trembling but unharmed. "Someone was here," Craddock said. The constable saw a figure in a dark coat, but they slipped down the back stairs before we could catch them. Lily's shout scared them off. Lily clutched her apron. "I was checking the linens, miss, like you said, and I saw someone at your door. I didn't think, just shouted." "You did splendidly, Lily," Miss Marple said. "Did you see anything else?" "A face, perhaps." Lily shook her head. "It was too dark, but I smelled something. Perfume, like what Miss Evelyn wears at the estate, sweet, like jasmine." Miss Marple's mind sharpened. Evelyn Hawthorne, with her cold eyes and calculated charm, had reacted oddly at tea. The perfume was a clue, though not definitive. The killer could be Evelyn, or someone planting suspicion on her. Dr. Price, with his shaky alibi, remained a possibility, as did Mrs. Barrett, whose connection to Captain Harroway's scandal loomed. Large Craddock searched the hallway, finding a small screwdriver dropped near the door likely used to tamper with the lock. "We'll keep this quiet," he said. "If the killer thinks they've gone unnoticed, they may try again." Miss Marple nodded. "They're rattled, Inspector. My rumour worked, but we must be ready. They won't stop now." As Craddock and Lily left, Miss Marple locked her door again, her mind racing. The trap had nearly worked, but the killer was cunning. She thought of St. Mary Mead, of a similar case where a cornered blackmailer had lashed out, revealing themselves in desperation. The parallel gave her hope. The murderer was close, their masks slipping. She would need to tighten the net to push them further. She returned to her knitting, the needles clicking softly in the quiet room. The jasmine perfume lingered in her thoughts, a delicate thread in the web she was weaving. Tomorrow she would visit the Hawthorne estate again, probing deeper into Evelyn's motives and Price's secrets. The killer had made their move tonight and failed. Miss Marple would ensure they didn't get another chance. The night stretched on, and Miss Marple, ever vigilant, kept her eyes on the door, her mind as sharp as the needles in her hands. Chapter 10. The Third Victim. The morning mist clung to Dannemouth like a shroud, curling around the gabled roofs and seeping into the cobblestone streets. Miss Jane Marple stood at her window in the seaside hotel, her sharp eyes tracing the slow drift of fog over the harbour. The air was heavy with the temps of salt and the faint, unsettling quiet that follows a tragedy. She had not slept well. The events of the past days, Clara Fielding's poisoning, Tom Ellis's brutal death in the greenhouse, and the taunting letters that seemed to know her to Wellhead, woven a web of suspicion that tightened with each passing hour. Now, as the town stirred awake, she felt the weight of a new dread. Something was coming. The letters had promised as much. She adjusted her shawl, her fingers lingering on the soft wool, and turned to the small writing desk where the latest letter lay, its edges slightly curled from her repeated handling. The words, written in that same precise, mocking hand, burned in her memory. Her secret will bury her, just as the next will fall. The vagueness was deliberate, a goad to keep her chasing shadows. But Miss Marple was not one to be led blindly. She had spent a lifetime observing the small, telling details of human nature, the twitch of a lip, the hesitation in a voice, the way a hand might linger too long on a teacup. And now, in Dannemouth, those details were beginning to form a pattern. Knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Lily, the hotel maid, her round face flushed from the morning's work. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple," she said, twisting her apron in her hands. "But there's news. Terrible news. It's Mr. Hawthorne. He's been found dead. At the estate. Strangled, they say, in his study." Miss Marple's heart gave a quiet lurch, though her face remained composed. "Strangled," she repeated softly, as if testing the word. "When was this discovered, Lily?" "Just an hour ago, miss. The housekeeper, Mrs. Barrett, found him when she brought his morning tea. The whole town's in a tizzy. Inspector Craddock's up there now, and they've got a vagrant in custody, a poor soul who was seen near the estate last night." "But," Lily hesitated, her eyes wide, "it don't feel right, does it? 3 deaths in a week." "No, Lily," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm. "It doesn't feel right at all." She thanked the maid and sent her on her way, then sat at the desk, her mind racing. Percival Hawthorne, the reclusive master of the estate, was the third victim. The letters had warned of a murder, and now it had come to pass. But why Hawthorne, and why now? The answer, she suspected, lay in the tangled threads of the past her past, and the secrets the letter writer claimed to know. She dressed quickly, choosing a sensible tweed skirt and a lavender cardigan, her usual armor against the world's uncertainties. Her straw hat, adorned with a single silk rose, sat neatly on her head as she made her way downstairs. The hotel lobby buzzed with hushed voices, guests exchanging rumors over their breakfast trays. Miss Marple caught fragments of their talk, strangled. With a cord, a robbery gone wrong, the vagrants to blame, but she paid them little mind. Gossip was a useful tool, but only when sifted carefully. Outside, the mist had begun to lift, revealing the grey sweep of the sea beyond. The promenade. Miss Marple walked briskly toward the Hawthorne estate, her umbrella tapping the pavement like a metronome. The estate loomed at the edge of town, its iron gates flanked by stone lions weathered by years of salt and wind. A constable stood guard, his face grim as he waved her through. "Inspector Craddock's expecting you, miss," he said, touching his cap. The house itself was a study in faded grandeur, its ivy-clad walls and tall windows speaking of wealth that had long since lost its shine. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and wax polish, undercut by something sharper fear, perhaps, or the lingering presence of death. Inspector Craddock met her in the hall, his broad shoulders stooped with fatigue. He was a young man for his rank, with a quick mind and a respect for Miss Marple's unconventional methods, though he sometimes hid it behind a gruff demeanour. "Miss Marple," he said, shaking her hand, "I'm glad you're here, though I wish it were under better circumstances. It's a bad business." Hawthorne was found at his desk, a cord around his neck. No signs of a struggle, but he lowered his voice. There was something else. A note pinned to his jacket. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A note. What did it say? Craddock hesitated, then led her to the study, a cavernous room lined with bookshelves and heavy furniture. The curtains were drawn, casting the space in a gloomy half-light. Percival Hawthorne's body had been removed, but the desk remained. Untouched, its surface cluttered with papers, an inkstand, and a silver cigarette case. Craddock handed her a small evidence bag containing a slip of paper. The words, written in the same hand as the letters, were stark, "For Jane's sins." Miss Marple felt a chill, though she kept her expression neutral. "Jane," she murmured, "my name, of course. The killer wants me to know this is personal." She handed the bag back to Craddock. "And the vagrant you've arrested. What? Do we know about him?" "A drifter named Mick Taylor," Craddock said. "He's been seen begging around town for weeks. A gardener spotted him lurking near the estate last night, and we found a bit of rope in his pack that matches the murder. Weapon. He's not talking, though just mumbles about being innocent." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already turning over the details. A vagrant made a convenient scapegoat, but the note suggested a more calculated mind at work. "May I see the study, Inspector, and Mr. Hawthorne's papers?" Craddock agreed, though he warned her to touch nothing. She moved carefully around the room, her eyes taking in every detail. The scuff on the floor near the desk, the faint smudge of ash on the blotter, the way the books on the shelf were slightly misaligned, as if someone had rifled through them. She paused at the desk, her gaze settling on a leather-bound ledger half hidden beneath a stack of letters. "Did you examine this?" she asked. "Not yet," Craddock admitted. "We've been focused on the body and the note." "Why?" Miss Marple opened the ledger with a gloved hand, revealing columns of numbers and cryptic notations. "Mr. Hawthorne was a man of secrets," she said, "and secrets, Inspector, are often at the heart of murder." She scanned the pages, her brow furrowing. The entries hinted at financial transactions, large sums moving through obscure accounts, some dated years ago. One name caught her eye: Haraway. Captain Haraway, the suitor from her youth, whose disgrace had been the subject of the letter's taunts. "Inspector," she said, closing the ledger, "I believe Mr. Hawthorne's death is connected to his past, and possibly to mine. We must speak to the household. Someone here knows more than they're saying." Craddock arranged for the household to gather in the drawing room, a stately space with high ceilings and a fireplace that crackled fitfully. Evelyn Hawthorne, the victim's niece, sat rigidly on a velvet sofa, her pale face framed by a severe black dress. Dr. Leonard Price, her fiancé, stood beside her, his charming smile replaced by a tense frown. Mrs. Barrett, the housekeeper, hovered near the door, her hands clasped tightly, while the remaining staffer, cook, and a footman stood awkwardly in the background. Miss Marple began gently, as was her way, asking about Hawthorne's habits and visitors. Evelyn claimed her uncle had been withdrawn since his return, rarely leaving the estate. "He was a private man," she said, her voice clipped. "He didn't share his business with me." Dr. Price nodded in agreement. "Percival was eccentric, but harmless. I can't imagine who'd want him dead." Mrs. Barrett, however, was less forthcoming. When Miss Marple asked if she'd noticed anything unusual, the housekeeper's eyes darted to the floor. "Nothing out of the ordinary, Miss," she muttered. "Just the usual duties." Miss Marple smiled kindly, but her mind was racing. Mrs. Barrett's unease, Evelyn's coldness, Price's too smooth assurances was a piece of the puzzle. She turned to Craddock. "Inspector, might we examine Mr. Hawthorne's correspondence? Letters, perhaps, or business papers?" Craddock sent a constable to retrieve the documents, and Miss Marple used the moment to observe the room. Evelyn's fingers twisted a handkerchief, betraying her composure. Price whispered something to her, and she nodded curtly. Mrs. Barrett, meanwhile, slipped out, claiming she needed to check on the kitchen. Miss Marple made a mental note to follow up with her later. The constable returned with a bundle of letters, most of them mundane bills, invitations, a few personal notes, but one, tucked inside an unmarked envelope, stood out. It was a draft of a will dated only a week earlier, leaving the bulk of Hawthorne's estate to Evelyn, with a substantial sum to Dr. Price for services rendered. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Services rendered," she repeated. "Rather vague, don't you think, Inspector?" Craddock frowned. It could mean anything: medical care, business advice. Price is a doctor, after all. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her tone neutral, but her thoughts were elsewhere. A will, a fortune, and a murder, the combination was too neat to be coincidence. She recalled the ledger's reference to Haraway, and wondered if Hawthorne's wealth had been built on the ruins of that old scandal. Had someone Margaret Haraway, perhaps, hiding as Mrs. Barrett sought revenge? Or was the motive closer to home, in Evelyn's ambition or Price's greed? As the meeting ended, Miss Marple lingered, pretending to adjust her hat. She overheard Evelyn and Price in the hall, their voices low but urgent. "It's under control," Price said. "Just keep your nerve." Evelyn's reply was sharp. "I'm not the one who's slipping." Miss Marple filed the exchange away, her suspicions deepening. She returned to the hotel, her mind a whirl of possibilities. The note pinned to Hawthorne's body, for Jane's sins, was a direct challenge. But it also suggested the killer was growing reckless. 3 murders, each tied to the estate, each accompanied by a taunt. The pattern was clear, but the motive remained elusive. That afternoon, she sat in the hotel lounge, sipping tea and reviewing her notes. The letters, the ledger, the will all pointed to a conspiracy rooted in the past. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where motives were often simple: jealousy, greed, fear. Here, the stakes felt higher, the secrets darker. She recalled a case from years ago, a village woman who'd poisoned her husband to hide a financial debt. The parallels were striking: Clara's poisoning, Tom's bludgeoning, Hawthorne's strangling. Each death silenced a threat, but to whom? Lily brought a fresh pot of tea, her face pale. "Miss Marple, they're saying the vagrants confessed," she whispered. "But I don't believe it. He's not clever enough to write those notes, is he?" Miss Marple patted her hand. "You're quite right, Lily. The truth is often hidden in plain sight." She resolved to visit the police station and speak to Mick Taylor herself. If he was innocent, as she suspected, the real killer was still at large, watching her every move. At the station, Taylor was a pitiful sight, his clothes ragged and his eyes darting nervously. He insisted he'd only been near the estate to scavenge. "Food. I didn't touch the old man," he said, his voice cracking. "I swear it." Miss Marple studied him closely. His fear was genuine, but his story held no clues. She left the station, her thoughts turning to the household. Evelyn's inheritance, Price's vague services, Mrs. Barrett's secrecy was a thread in the web. And then there was the perfume she'd noticed during the attempted break-in. A floral scent she now associated with Evelyn. Was Evelyn the mastermind, or a pawn in someone else's game? Back at the hotel, Miss Marple found a new letter slipped under her door. Her heart quickened as she opened it. The message was brief: "The truth lies in the greenhouse, midnight." No signature, no taunt, just an invitation. She knew it was a trap, but also an opportunity. The killer was growing bold, and bold criminals made mistakes. She telephoned Inspector Craddock, outlining her plan. "I'll go to the greenhouse," she said, "but I'll need your men nearby." Discreetly, of course. Craddock protested, but Miss Marple was firm. "This is our chance, Inspector. The killer wants to end this, and so do I." As night fell, Dannymoth grew quiet, the mist returning to cloak the streets. Miss Marple prepared carefully, tucking a small flashlight into her handbag and pinning her shawl with a brooch that doubled as a makeshift weapon. She thought of her secret, her refusal of Captain Haraway's proposal, a choice that had shaped her life of independence. Had it also set this chain of events in motion? She pushed the thought aside. Regret was a luxury she couldn't afford. The Hawthorne estate was dark as she approached, the greenhouse a ghostly silhouette against the moonless sky. She moved silently, her senses alert. Inside, the air was warm and heavy with the scent of earth and decay. She waited, her flashlight casting a thin beam across the rows of plants. Footsteps crunched outside, slow and deliberate. Miss Marple tensed, her hand on the brooch. A figure stepped into the doorway, their face obscured by shadow. "Miss Marple," a voice said, low and mocking. "You're too clever for your own good." She recognized the voice instantly, Dr. Price. Her heart raced, but her voice was steady. "And you, Doctor, are too reckless for yours." Price stepped forward, a glint of metal in his hand. "You should have stayed in St. Mary Mead," he said. "This ends tonight." Before he could move, a shout rang out Craddock's voice, followed by the thud of boots. Price froze, his face twisting in fury. Evelyn appeared behind him, her eyes wide with panic. "Leonard, stop," she cried. "It's over." Price lunged, but Craddock's men were faster, pinning him to the ground. Evelyn collapsed, sobbing, as the truth poured out. Price had orchestrated the murders Clara to silence her exposé, Tom to cover his tracks, Hawthorne to secure the inheritance. Evelyn, blinded by love, had helped him, believing his lies. The letters, written by Mrs. Barrett, were a distraction, a way to keep Miss Marple off balance. As Price was led away, Miss Marple looked at Evelyn, her heart heavy. "You loved him," she said softly, "but love can blind us to the truth." Evelyn nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for everything." Miss Marple left the greenhouse, the mist cold against her skin. The case was nearly solved, but questions lingered. Mrs. Barrett's role, the full extent of Hawthorne's dealings, her own past, they would need unraveling. For now, though she had stopped a killer, and that, she thought, was enough.